While I was sitting in a sterile hospice room planning my grandmother's funeral and paying the bills she left behind, my older brother was burning through her estate money at a luxury resort in Aspen. When I finally reached him, he just laughed and said she was gone, so why should her money sit in a bank? But he had no idea that when he tried to swipe that card again, every single dollar would vanish. My name is Chloe. I am 32 years old, working as a payroll clerk at a mid-sized paper supplier in Portland, Oregon. And this is the story of how being the reliable daughter finally pushed me over the edge. The end did not come like it does in the movies. There were no grand final words, no dramatic gasps for air, no cinematic moments of closure. There was only the steady, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, followed by a long, terrible, unbroken tone. I sat in the uncomfortable vinyl chair beside the hospital bed, holding my grandmother's cooling hand in mine. The room smelled of sharp rubbing alcohol and the faint scent of the lavender lotion I had rubbed into her skin just an hour before. I stared at the green line moving flat across the black screen. The silence in the room felt incredibly heavy. I was entirely alone. A nurse walked in, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly against the linoleum floor. She took one look at the monitor, then looked at me with eyes full of practiced, gentle sympathy. She checked my grandmother's pulse, noted the time on her clipboard, and spoke the words I had been dreading for 6 months. She told me my grandmother had passed. She asked me if there was anyone I needed to call, specifically asking for the next of kin to handle the immediate arrangements. My hands were shaking as I pulled my phone from my pocket. I frantically scrolled through my contacts and pressed the name of my older brother, Trent. Trent was 35 years old. He was a self-proclaimed entrepreneur who constantly lived beyond his means, always wearing designer clothes funded by someone else, always pitching a new startup that was guaranteed to make millions, but never seemed to generate a single dollar. He was the eldest. He was the golden child. He was supposed to be here. He had promised me he was only 10 minutes away. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then it clicked over to his voicemail. His upbeat, overly confident voice filled the quiet hospice room. He said he was out crushing goals and making moves and to leave a message. I hung up and dialed again. My fingers felt numb. My chest was tight with panic and grief. Again, the phone rang until it hit voicemail. I tried a 3rd time. I tried a 4th time. I sent text messages begging him to answer, telling him it was over, telling him our grandmother was gone, and that I needed him here right now. Nothing came back. Not a call, not a text, not a single sign of life. The nurse returned with a clipboard full of paperwork. The shift from caring for a dying person to managing a deceased body is incredibly fast and incredibly cold. The hospital needed decisions. They needed to know which funeral home to contact. They needed authorization to release the body. They needed signatures. I looked at the empty chair on the other side of the bed, the chair Trent was supposed to be sitting in. I swallowed the lump in my throat, wiped my eyes with the back of my sleeve, and took the pen from the nurse. I handled the coroner. I handled the release forms. I handled the tears all by myself. This was not a new dynamic. As I sat in the hallway waiting for the transport team to arrive, my mind drifted back to the pattern that had defined my entire life. I was always the workhorse. I was the reliable one who kept the family functioning. Whenever the rent was short, whenever a crisis hit, whenever a relative fell ill, my parents always looked to me. I was the girl with the steady payroll job, the girl who knew how to balance a spreadsheet and manage a crisis without making a fuss. Trent was different. Trent was allowed to dream. I remember sitting at the kitchen table when I was 17 doing the family taxes because my parents were too overwhelmed to figure it out. Trent was 19, pacing the living room, talking about a real estate venture that required a massive investment from our parents' savings. When I pointed out that the math did not make sense, my mother had placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. She looked at me with a mixture of fadaï and dismissal. She said, "Trent is a visionary, Chloe. You are a practical girl." That one sentence had sealed my fate. Being practical meant doing the heavy lifting while receiving none of the praise. It meant giving up my weekends to clean my grandmother's gutters, while Trent was busy networking at expensive downtown bars. It meant driving a 10-year-old Honda Civic to my office job every morning, while Trent leased a brand new luxury SUV because, according to him, you had to look successful to be successful. He lived in a state of constant grandiosity, floating above the mundane realities of life, while I was anchored to the ground, carrying the weight of all his responsibilities. My grandmother had been the only one who seemed to understand. She was a tough, no-nonsense woman who had worked as a bookkeeper for 40 years. She saw right through Trent's charm and expensive suits. When she fell ill, Trent made a big show of stepping up. He declared himself the head of the family. He loudly announced to all our relatives that he was managing her care, coordinating with the doctors, and making sure she had the best of everything. He took the title of the devoted grandson. But I was the one who actually did the work. I was the one who took unpaid leave from my job to sit by her bed. I was the one who bathed her, who fed her ice chips when she could no longer swallow water, who read to her when the pain medication made her too tired to keep her eyes open. Trent would show up once a week, stay for 15 minutes, take a sad-looking selfie, holding her hand to post on his social media, and then vanish claiming he had an urgent meeting with investors. And now, in the exact moment when the absolute bare minimum was required of him, he was nowhere to be found. The hospice social worker sat down next to me on the bench. She asked if I was okay to drive home. She asked if I had support. I nodded and lied, saying my brother was on his way, that he must have just been caught in traffic. I did not want to admit out loud that my own brother had abandoned me with the body of the woman who had raised our father. It felt too shameful. It felt like a failure on my part, even though it was entirely his. I spent the next 3 hours making phone calls. I called the funeral home my grandmother had selected years ago. I coordinated the transport of her remains. I gathered her personal belongings from the sterile room, packing her reading glasses, her favorite knitted cardigan, and the small silver cross necklace she always kept on her nightstand into a plastic hospital bag. Every time my phone vibrated in my pocket, my heart jumped, hoping it was Trent calling to say he was pulling into the parking lot, calling to apologize, calling to share the grief that was currently threatening to crush my chest. But it was only automated emails from my work, reminding me of payroll deadlines I was going to miss. I walked out of the hospice facility just as the gray Portland morning was breaking. The sky was the color of wet concrete, and a cold, steady drizzle was falling over the parking lot. I stood by my old car, totally exhausted, physically drained, and completely heartbroken. I held the plastic bag of my grandmother's belongings against my chest and finally let myself cry. I wept for the loss of the only person in my family who actually saw me. I wept for the sheer exhaustion of having to be the practical girl one more time. But mostly I tried to convince myself to forgive my brother. I told myself a story right there in the parking lot. I told myself that Trent was just avoiding the pain of death. I reasoned that he was a sensitive visionary, that seeing our grandmother take her final breath would have been too traumatic for him. I convinced myself that he had parked his car somewhere down the street, paralyzed by grief, unable to walk through those sliding glass doors, because his heart was just too broken. I made excuses for him, just like my mother had taught me to do my entire life. I decided I would carry this burden for him, because that is what family does. I was so incredibly foolish. I thought my brother was hiding from his grief. I thought he was sitting in his luxury apartment, shedding tears for the woman who had loved us both. I did not know that at the exact moment I was signing release papers for a body bag, Trent was standing at a priority boarding gate at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. I did not know that while I was holding our grandmother's lifeless hand, he was holding a first-class boarding pass to Colorado. I had absolutely no idea that my brother was treating our grandmother's death not as a tragedy, but as a winning lottery ticket. And I was about to find out exactly how much that ticket cost. The morning after a death does not feel like a new day. It feels like a relentless continuation of a very long, very dark night. I had not slept a single minute since the heart monitor flatlined. I drove to the funeral home in a complete daze, the relentless Portland rain blurring my windshield, my mind playing a continuous loop of my grandmother's final labored breaths. I was running on nothing but stale hospital coffee shock and pure adrenaline. The plastic hospital bag containing her favorite cardigan and her reading glasses sat on the passenger seat next to me, a cruel physical reminder that she was actually gone. I parked my 10-year-old car in the immaculate, freshly swept lot of the funeral home, taking a deep breath before stepping out into the freezing downpour. The funeral home was located in a stately brick building draped in manicured ivy, designed specifically to project an aura of quiet, expensive comfort. Inside, the air was thick, almost suffocating with the heavy scent of white lilies and lemon furniture polish. A large grandfather clock ticked methodically in the corner of the lobby, counting down the seconds of a world that had seemingly stopped making sense. I was ushered into a plush, dimly lit office featuring heavy velvet drapes and a massive mahogany desk. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, feeling completely out of place in my damp raincoat, my wrinkled slacks, and my exhausted, tear-stained face. The funeral director, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Gable, sat across from me. He wore an immaculate charcoal suit, a perfectly knotted silk tie, and an expression of rehearsed professional empathy. He spoke in hushed velvet tones, laying out thick glossy catalogs of caskets, floral arrangements, and vault options on the polished wood between us. We spent over an hour meticulously going over my grandmother's final wishes. She had been a highly practical woman throughout her life, but she had expressly wanted a dignified, beautiful farewell. We selected a solid oak casket with brass fittings, a stunning spray of white roses and hydrangeas, a lovely plot under a large willow tree, and a simple graveside service for our extended family and her church friends. Mr. Gable tallied up the cost with swift practice strokes of his gold fountain pen. The total came to exactly $12,000 for the deposit to secure the arrangements and begin the preparations. He slid the itemized invoice across the desk, offering me a sympathetic smile that did not quite reach his eyes. If I had been paying for this out of my own pocket, I would have collapsed right there. I'm a payroll clerk. I make $42,000 a year. A $12,000 bill would completely ruin me. But I was not worried about the cost. 2 years ago, my grandmother had specifically set up a designated joint burial and emergency account. She had funded it generously after selling a piece of property, making sure there was a massive safety net of exactly $150,000 to cover her end-of-life care, her funeral expenses, and whatever small inheritances she wanted to leave behind for Trent and me. She had given me the debit card for that specific account, trusting me as the practical, responsible one to handle the heavy logistics when the inevitable time came. She had explicitly wanted to make sure neither my brother nor I would ever have to stress over money while we were actively grieving her loss. I reached into my damp purse and pulled out the crisp blue debit card. I handed it to Mr. Gable with a profound sense of quiet relief, incredibly grateful that my grandmother had possessed the foresight and the love to protect us from financial burden in our absolute darkest hour. Mr. Gable took the card, his sympathetic smile widening just a fraction as he typed the $12,000 deposit amount into his sleek desktop terminal. He swiped the blue card through the machine. I watched his perfectly manicured fingers move, taking a deep, shuddering breath, ready to sign the receipt and go home to finally sleep. The terminal beeped. It was not the soft, pleasant, confirming chime of an approved transaction. It was a harsh, sharp electronic tone of rejection. Mr. Gable frowned slightly, his perfectly groomed eyebrows drawing together in mild confusion. He looked at the digital screen, then looked back across the mahogany desk at me. He softly stated that the card had declined. He immediately smoothed his expression, suggesting it might just be a simple daily limit issue, or perhaps a routine fraud protection flag, considering it was a rather large transaction. I felt a tiny sharp prickle of anxiety at the base of my neck, but I quickly pushed it down. I am a payroll clerk. I spend my entire professional life dealing with bank errors, processing glitches, and routing mistakes. I told him to please try it again, confidently explaining that the account was fully funded specifically for this exact purpose and that there should be more than enough to cover the cost. He nodded politely and swiped the card a second time. The terminal processed for 3 agonizing seconds. The loading circle spun on the small screen. Then came that same harsh, unforgiving beep. Declined. The silence in the plush office suddenly felt incredibly heavy, thick enough to choke on. Mr. Gable's practiced sympathy vanished in an instant, replaced by a look I knew all too well from my childhood. It was a look of quiet impatience mixed with a deeply condescending pity. It was the exact look high-end merchants gave people who clearly could not afford to pay for their items. He slid the blue debit card back across the polished mahogany desk, carefully avoiding direct eye contact with me. He softly, almost patronizingly, suggested that perhaps I had another form of payment. He asked if I might want to use a personal credit card, just to secure the deposit, implying that we could sort out the rest later. The humiliation hit me like a physical, violent blow to the chest. The heat rushed rapidly up my neck and violently burned my cheeks. I sat there in my damp, cheap clothes, feeling the absolute crushing weight of his silent judgment. I knew exactly what he was thinking. He thought I was just another, unprepared, grieving relative trying to pass off a maxed-out card to secure a luxury funeral I had absolutely no business planning. I stammered a frantic apology, my voice shaking so badly I could barely form the words. I told him I urgently needed to call the bank, that there must be some terrible, catastrophic mistake with the routing system. I grabbed the blue card, my fingers trembling so uncontrollably that I almost dropped it onto his pristine Persian rug. I hastily grabbed my damp purse, excused myself without making eye contact, and practically ran out of the oppressive, lily-scented office. I pushed fiercely through the heavy glass doors of the funeral home and stepped out into the freezing Portland rain. The bitter cold air hit my flushed, burning face, but it did absolutely nothing to calm the frantic, terrified beating of my heart. I stood under the small canvas awning, shivering violently, clutching my smartphone with both hands. Water dripped from the brick facade above, splashing heavily onto my screen as I desperately opened my mobile banking application. My fingers were stiff frozen and completely uncoordinated. I mistyped my password twice, blind panic rising rapidly in my throat like bitter bile. The application temporarily locked me out for 30 seconds due to the failed attempts. Those 30 seconds felt like 30 agonizing years. I stood there, watching passing cars splash through the deep puddles on the gray street, trying desperately to force my ragged breathing to slow down. I repeatedly told myself it was just an automatic freeze on the account. I reasoned that the bank had somehow been notified of my grandmother's passing by the hospital and had locked the funds for legal review. That had to be it. It was simply a bureaucratic delay. It had to be a safety measure. Finally, the security countdown timer cleared from the screen. I carefully, meticulously typed my credentials again and pressed the login button. The screen transitioned to the loading page, the digital circles spinning endlessly. Then the dashboard appeared, displaying the standard list of my personal checking and savings accounts. Right below them was the linked joint burial account I shared with my grandmother. The page fully loaded. I stared at the numbers on the glowing screen. I stared until my vision completely blurred, until the freezing rain completely soaked through the shoulders of my coat, until the breath was entirely, violently punched out of my lungs. The burial account, the secure financial safety net that had held exactly $150,000 just 2 short days ago, displayed an available balance of $34. $34. My legs went entirely weak. I stumbled backward, leaning heavily against the wet, freezing brick wall of the funeral home just to keep my body from collapsing onto the wet pavement. This was impossible. This was mathematically, logically impossible. I quickly tapped on the account balance to open the detailed transaction history, my mind frantically, desperately searching for logic, for a massive bank error, for an accidental double charge, for any rational explanation that did not involve the horrifying truth that was slowly creeping into my mind. The ledger loaded on the screen, and the absolute truth hit me significantly harder than the freezing Portland rain. Right at the very top of the transaction history was a massive outgoing wire transfer. The bold red numbers indicated a deduction of $149,966. I dragged my shaking finger across the screen to look at the exact timestamp of the transaction. The digital transfer had been officially initiated and executed at 5:15 in the morning. My grandmother had taken her final struggling breath in that sterile hospice room at 3:15 in the morning. Exactly 2 hours after the heart monitor had flatlined. 2 hours after she passed away, while I was sitting completely alone in a cold room, crying over her lifeless body, waiting for the coroner, and frantically calling my brother's phone, begging him to come comfort me. The money had been meticulously moved. I clicked on the transaction details to view the destination account. It was not a bank error. It was not a hospital billing mistake. It was a direct authorized wire transfer into a personal checking account registered solely to Trent. My older brother, the golden child, the visionary, who could never hold down a real job, had completely drained the entire estate. But the horrifying digital ledger did not stop there. Below the massive wire transfer, sitting boldly in the pending transaction section of his linked account profile, were 3 incredibly fresh charges. Trent had not just moved the money to secure it for the family. He had not transferred it to protect it from probate. He was already actively, aggressively spending it. There was a pending charge for $2,800 for 2 first-class tickets on Delta Airlines. There was a massive pending authorization for exactly $4,000 at the St. Regis Aspen Resort. And right beneath that, processed just an hour ago, was a charge for $1,200 at an exclusive high-end luxury ski boutique. I stood completely alone in the freezing rain, violently shivering, clutching my phone against my chest. The reality of the situation washed over me in a sickening, suffocating wave. While I had been desperately begging him to come to the hospital to say goodbye, while I was holding our grandmother's cooling hand, while I was sitting in a funeral home facing absolute humiliation because I could not pay the deposit for her casket, my older brother had been using our dead grandmother's money to buy first-class tickets and designer ski gear for a luxury vacation. He had ignored my desperate grieving phone calls because he was busy booking a 5-star resort in Aspen with the money meant to put our grandmother in the ground. The initial shock and the suffocating grief began to slowly evaporate from my body right there in the rain. It was replaced instantly by something entirely different. The lifelong burden of being the good, quiet, practical daughter finally snapped. The sadness burned away, leaving behind a cold, sharp, unyielding, and absolute rage. I wiped the freezing rain from my phone screen, took a deep breath, and dialed his number one more time. I stood frozen in the parking lot of the funeral home, the icy Portland rain soaking through my thin wool coat. My thumb hovered over Trent's name on my phone screen. Just minutes ago, I had been standing in Mr. Gable's plush office, burning with a humiliation so deep it felt like a physical fever. Now, staring at the digital proof that my older brother had drained $149,966 from our grandmother's burial account, the fever morphed into absolute blinding clarity. I pressed call. I lifted the phone to my ear. My hand was shaking so violently that the plastic edge of the device rattled against my earring. It rang once. It rang twice. I fully expected it to go to voicemail again. I expected the same upbeat, arrogant recorded greeting I had listened to while I sat beside our grandmother's lifeless body in the hospice ward. But on the 4th ring, the line clicked open. The sounds that flooded through the receiver were so jarring, so completely detached from the reality of death and grief that I actually pulled the phone away from my ear for a second just to make sure I had dialed the right number. I heard the sharp, bright clinking of crystal champagne flutes. I heard the heavy rhythmic thumping of upbeat après-ski music playing over a high-end sound system. I heard the dull roar of a wealthy, carefree crowd. And cutting right through all of it, loud and piercing, was a laugh I would recognize anywhere. It was Lauren, Trent's wife of 4 years. Lauren was the kind of woman who viewed family obligations as optional networking events. In the last 5 years of my grandmother's life as her health steadily declined, Lauren had not visited her a single time. Not once. She had always claimed that nursing homes and hospices gave her severe anxiety and ruined her aesthetic energy. She had refused to come to Sunday dinners because my grandmother's house in Southeast Portland was not in a neighborhood she felt comfortable parking her leased Audi in. But now, less than 12 hours after my grandmother took her final breath, Lauren was laughing a bright, carefree, champagne-fueled laugh. "Hello," Trent answered. His voice was loud, projecting over the music. He sounded relaxed. He sounded like a man who did not have a care in the entire world. "Trent." I gasped. The sound of my own voice startled me. It was raw thick with tears I had not fully shed and a rage I had not yet learned how to hold. "Where are you?" "Oh, hey, Chloe," he said casually, as if I were calling to ask about the weather. "Listen, it is super loud in here. We just got off the slopes and hit the lounge. What is up?" "The slopes." The word echoed in my mind. The slopes. I gripped the phone so tightly, my knuckles turned completely white. "Trent," I said, forcing every syllable through my clenched jaw. "I am standing in the parking lot of the funeral home. I just tried to pay the $12,000 deposit for grandmother's service." "The card declined, Trent. The bank account is empty. There was a brief pause on his end. The thumping bass of the ski lodge music seemed to get louder. I waited for him to act shocked. I waited for him to panic, to tell me there had been a terrible banking error, to say he would call fraud protection immediately. Instead, he let out a long, heavy sigh. The kind of sigh a parent gives a child who is asking too many annoying questions. Right about that, he set his tone shifting into that smooth, condescending register he always used when he was about to talk his way out of a lie. "I moved the funds this morning. I meant to text you, but the Wi-Fi on the flight was absolute garbage. You moved the funds." I repeated the words slowly, my brain struggling to process the sheer audacity of his confession. "You moved $150,000 into your personal checking account. Trent, that was grandmother's money. That was her burial fund. She died at 3:15 this morning. You wired that money at 5:15. He actually chuckled. It was a short, breathy sound of pure entitlement. "Chloe, relax," he said. "She is gone. Why should her money just sit in a bank doing nothing while we wait months for the lawyers to sort through the probate paperwork? I am the eldest. I am the executor of the estate. It is my responsibility to manage the assets. I am just protecting the capital. Protecting the capital." I practically screamed into the freezing rain. "You are not protecting anything." "I can see the pending charges, Trent. You spent $4,000 at the St. Regis in Aspen. You spent over $1,000 on ski clothes. You are using the money meant to bury our grandmother to fund a luxury vacation." In the background, I heard Lauren's voice slice through the music. "Tell her to stop causing drama, Trent. We are supposed to be celebrating." Celebrating. The word hit me like a physical blow. I had just spent the darkest night of my life holding a dying woman's hand, listening to the agonizing rattle of her final breaths, begging God to make her comfortable. I had sat alone in a sterile room, waiting for the coroner to arrive. And my brother and his wife were toasting champagne in Aspen, celebrating their sudden influx of unearned cash. Trent's voice came back on the line harder this time, stripped of the casual charm. "Look, Chloe, Lauren has been under an immense amount of stress lately. This whole situation with Grandma dying has been incredibly toxic for her mental health. She needed a break from all the family drama. I am the executor, which means the money is going to come to me eventually anyway. I am just taking an advance on my inheritance. We deserve a mental health break." I leaned my forehead against the cold, wet brick of the funeral home wall. The rain was streaming down my face, mixing with tears of absolute disbelief. "Trent, I do not care about your mental health break," I said, my voice cracking. "I need $12,000 right now. Mr. Gable is waiting inside. They will not prepare her body. They will not secure the plot. They will not do anything until the deposit is paid. You need to wire $12,000 back to the burial account right now." He scoffed. It was a sharp, dismissive sound that made my blood run cold. "Wire it back." "Chloe, I cannot do that. The funds are already tied up. Just put it on your credit card." "Put it on my credit card. I make $42,000 a year, Trent. I do not have a $12,000 credit limit. I do not have the money to bury her." This was her money. This was what she saved for. This was what— "Stop being so dramatic." Trent snapped, his voice dripping with absolute annoyance. "You are always so practical, Chloe. You are good at budgeting. You will figure it out. Ask the funeral home for a payment plan. Call Mom and Dad and see if they can float you a loan. Figure it out. I cannot figure out $12,000, Trent. You stole it." "I did not steal anything," he fired back, his tone turning vicious. I am the man of this family now. I am in charge. You handle the funeral arrangements. Keep it cheap and do not bother me for the rest of the weekend. I will reimburse whatever you spend when I get back and we sell grandmother's house. Just keep the receipts." Before I could say another word, before I could scream, before I could beg him to please, just do the right thing, for once in his miserable, selfish life, the line went dead. I slowly pulled the phone away from my ear. The screen was dark. The call had lasted exactly 3 minutes and 42 seconds. In less than 4 minutes, my older brother had justified abandoning our dying grandmother, admitted to draining her life savings, gaslighted me about his theft, and demanded that I plunge myself into massive financial debt to clean up his mess. I stood completely still under the small canvas awning of the funeral home. The freezing Portland rain continued to pour down, splashing against my cheap leather shoes. A car drove past its tires, hissing against the wet asphalt. I looked down at my shaking hands. I looked at the plastic hospital bag sitting on the passenger seat of my old car, containing the last physical traces of the woman who had loved me unconditionally. For 32 years, I had been the designated shock absorber for our family. I was the one who smoothed things over. I was the one who worked extra shifts to buy my own school clothes so my parents could afford to send Trent to expensive sports camps. I was the one who quietly paid my own rent while Trent bounced from one failed business venture to another, always bailed out by my parents or my grandmother. I had accepted my role. I had swallowed my pride. I had believed the narrative that I was simply built for endurance, while Trent was built for greatness. But standing there in the rain, listening to the dial tone echo in my head, the entire illusion shattered into a million jagged pieces. Trent was not a visionary. He was a parasite. He was a coward who ran from the reality of death because it was not glamorous or profitable. He had viewed our grandmother's declining health not as a tragedy, but as a countdown to a payday. And Lauren, the woman who could not bear the aesthetic discomfort of a nursing home, was perfectly comfortable spending the money of the woman who died in one. He had told me to keep the receipts. He had promised to reimburse me when he sold grandmother's house. I knew exactly what that meant. He intended to take the house too. He intended to walk in as the eldest son, list the property, take the profits, and maybe if he was feeling generous, toss me a few crumbs to cover the massive debt he was forcing me to take on today. He was banking on my compliance. He was banking on my lifelong habit of simply putting my head down and doing the hard work without ever fighting back. I looked back at the heavy glass doors of the funeral home. Behind those doors, Mr. Gable was sitting at his mahogany desk, waiting for a payment I could not make. I knew what I had to do next, and the sheer injustice of it made me want to scream until my throat bled. I would have to walk back into that plush, lily-scented office. I would have to look that man in the eye, swallow every ounce of my pride, and ask him to show me the absolute cheapest burial option they offered. I would have to select a basic pine box instead of the solid oak casket my grandmother had chosen. I would have to max out my single emergency credit card and drain the $3,000 I had painstakingly saved in my checking account just to give her a basic bare minimum service. I closed my eyes and let the freezing rain wash over my face. I took a deep, shuddering breath, pulling the icy air deep into my lungs. The sadness, the overwhelming, crushing grief that had paralyzed me since 3:15 this morning was completely gone. It had been entirely consumed by a cold, clinical, and absolutely terrifying anger. Trent thought he had won. He thought he had outsmarted the system, beaten the probate process, and secured his luxury lifestyle at my expense. He thought I was just the quiet, practical payroll clerk who would clean up his mess and say thank you. But he had fundamentally misunderstood something very important. Practical people do not just clean up messes. Practical people keep records. Practical people understand numbers and ledgers and rules. I opened my eyes, staring at the gray Portland sky. I walked back toward the glass doors of the funeral home, no longer a grieving, helpless girl. I was a woman going to war. I walked back through the heavy glass doors of the funeral home. The lemon polish and lily scent hit me again, but this time I did not feel intimidated. I felt completely hollowed out. Mr. Gable was still sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, his hands neatly folded over the glossy catalogs of luxury caskets. When he saw me, his practiced, sympathetic smile returned, though his eyes remained carefully guarded. He asked if I had resolved the issue with my bank. I sat down in the high-backed leather chair, looked him straight in the eye, and told him the designated burial account was no longer available. I watched his posture stiffen slightly. I did not offer an explanation about my brother. I did not cry. I simply opened my damp purse and pulled out my personal debit card and my only emergency credit card. I told him I needed to see the most basic options he offered. I needed to revise the entire plan. The solid oak casket with the brass fittings was gone. The lavish floral sprays were gone. The expensive plot location was gone. We went through the catalog again, turning past the glossy pages of luxury to the plain functional items hidden in the very back of the book. I chose a simple pine casket. I chose a modest floral arrangement of standard white carnations instead of the imported white roses my grandmother had loved. I cut every single corner I possibly could. The final total came to just under $9,000. It was a massive reduction from the original plan, but for a payroll clerk who makes $42,000 a year, it was an absolute devastating fortune. I handed him my debit card first. I instructed him to run it for $3,000. That was every single penny I had in my personal savings account. It was the money I had painstakingly put away month by month, $50 at a time, for car repairs, dental bills, and emergencies. It vanished in a single electronic swipe. Then I handed him my credit card. It had a limit of $6,000. I told him to put the remaining balance on it. The card maxed out immediately. I was left with absolutely nothing. No safety net, no backup plan. My bank account was completely drained and my debt was suddenly overwhelming. But as I signed the heavy stack of contracts, I did not feel a single ounce of regret about spending the money. I only felt a deep, agonizing ache that my grandmother, a woman who had worked so incredibly hard her entire life to ensure her own farewell would not burden anyone, was being buried on a maxed-out credit card because her golden grandson wanted to go skiing in Aspen. The next 4 days were a relentless blur of solitary, exhausting labor. I ran on zero sleep, entirely fueled by black coffee and the mechanical need to get things done. I wrote the obituary myself, sitting at my small kitchen table late at night, carefully trying to capture 80 years of a beautiful, hardworking life in just 300 words. I went to her house and chose her burial outfit, carefully pressing the wrinkles out of her favorite blue dress with shaking hands. I coordinated with the cemetery staff, spoke with her pastor to arrange the service, and organized a small reception in the church basement. I paid for the reception coffee and the simple bakery pastries out of the meager remaining cash I had in my checking account. Through all of it, my phone remained completely silent. Trent did not call to check on the arrangements. He did not text to ask how I was holding up. He did not ask when the funeral was scheduled. He simply vanished into his stolen luxury vacation, perfectly content to let his practical sister handle the grim, heavy reality of death. I was the good daughter. I was the reliable one. That was the role they had written for me, and they fully expected me to play it without a single complaint. The morning of the funeral was bitterly cold. The sky was blanketed in a thick, unrelenting gray that felt incredibly fitting for the day. The service was held at the small community church my grandmother had attended for over 30 years. It was a beautiful, modest building with stained glass windows that filtered the pale morning light into soft colors across the wooden pews. But when I stood at the front of the sanctuary and looked out at the room, the emptiness was absolutely devastating. There were about 20 people in attendance. They were mostly elderly church friends, a few of her former neighbors who still remembered her baking pies for the block, and a couple of my own co-workers who knew how close I was to her. The entire right side of the church, the side traditionally reserved for immediate family, was completely empty. I sat in the front row entirely alone. There were no parents to hold my hand. There was no older brother to lean on. The silence in the sanctuary felt infinitely heavier than the pine casket resting quietly at the altar. The pastor delivered a beautiful, heartfelt eulogy. He spoke about her boundless kindness, her quiet strength, and her unwavering dedication to her family. I sat there, listening to his gentle words, feeling the sharp, agonizing sting of reality piercing my chest. She had dedicated her entire life to a family that had ultimately abandoned her in death. When the service concluded, I stood by the heavy wooden doors of the church, thanking the attendees for coming, shaking their fragile, wrinkled hands, and accepting their quiet condolences. Everyone asked the exact same agonizing question: "Where is Trent?" They looked around the empty church lobby, their voices hushed with polite confusion and underlying judgment. I smiled a tight, painful smile, swallowing the bitter bile in my throat, and gave the answer I had rehearsed in the mirror that morning. I told them Trent was absolutely devastated and unfortunately could not make the flight in time. I protected his reputation. Even then, standing in the absolute ruins of my grandmother's life, I instinctively protected the golden boy from the consequences of his own selfish actions. We drove to the cemetery in a slow, quiet procession. The Portland rain had finally paused, leaving the air thick with gray mist and the heavy smell of damp earth and wet pine needles. The graveside service was brief and intensely solemn. I stood at the very edge of the open plot, watching the simple pine casket, resting on the mechanical lowering device above the dark, muddy soil. I clutched a single white carnation in my trembling hands. My coat was not thick enough to block the biting wind, but I barely felt the cold. This was it. This was the final goodbye. As the pastor opened his Bible and began reading the final comforting prayer for the departed, I felt my phone violently vibrate in my coat pocket. It was a sharp, sudden buzz that brutally pulled me out of my grief. I reached into my pocket, intending to turn the power off entirely out of respect for the moment, but as I pulled the device out, the screen lit up with a notification. It was an automatic alert from Instagram. I should have put the phone away. I should have turned it off and focused on the sacred moment in front of me. But a dark, undeniable intuition forced me to look at the screen. Lauren Trent's status-obsessed wife had just posted a new photo. I unlocked the phone and opened the application, my eyes struggling to adjust to the bright screen against the gloomy, miserable backdrop of the cemetery. The image loaded instantly on my feed. It was a perfectly filtered, high-definition photograph of Lauren and Trent sitting on a plush leather sofa in the exclusive private lounge of the St. Regis Aspen Resort. A massive, roaring stone fireplace illuminated the background. Trent was wearing a brand new, incredibly expensive-looking cashmere sweater. Lauren was holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne, smiling brightly at the camera with her perfectly whitened teeth. Resting prominently on the rustic wooden table in front of them was a designer ski bag easily worth $3,000, its gold hardware gleaming in the firelight. The caption beneath the photo felt like a physical rusted knife twisting directly into my chest. It read, "Escaping the winter blues with my amazing husband. Sometimes you just have to treat yourself and forget the stress. Living my best life. Treat yourself. Forget the stress. Living my best life." I stared at the glowing screen, the arrogant words burning themselves permanently into my retinas. The timestamp showed the photo had been posted exactly 4 minutes ago, while I was standing in the freezing mud, listening to a pastor pray over the grave of the woman who had wiped our tears and funded our childhoods while I was buried under $9,000 of crippling, terrifying debt to ensure she did not have a pauper's funeral. My brother was drinking vintage champagne, purchased entirely with her stolen burial funds. He was treating himself. He was forgetting the stress. I slowly lowered the phone. I looked back up at the simple pine casket suspended over the dark hole in the earth. I looked at the small, pathetic group of elderly friends standing with their heads bowed in the biting cold. And in that exact moment, the profound, suffocating sorrow that had paralyzed me for the last 4 days completely vanished. It evaporated into the damp air, too, leaving absolutely no trace of grief, sadness, or mourning behind. What took its place was something cold, hard, and entirely unbreakable. The burden of the good daughter simply ceased to exist. I was entirely done being the practical girl. I was done quietly absorbing the financial and emotional blows so my brother could continue playing the visionary entrepreneur without ever facing reality. They had relied heavily on my compliance for 32 years. They had assumed that I would just cry, pay the funeral bill, and eventually move on because I was too sensible and too weak to cause a scene. They thought they could literally steal from a dead woman, take a luxury vacation while she was being lowered into the ground, and leave me holding the bag without facing a single consequence. I stepped forward to the edge of the grave and dropped my white carnation onto the smooth wood of the casket. I did not say goodbye. I did not shed another tear. I stared down into the dark earth and made a silent, sacred vow to the woman inside that box. I promised her that they would not get away with this. I promised that every single dollar Trent had stolen from her would cost him everything he cared about in this world. He wanted to play the role of the wealthy executor. He wanted to claim his unearned inheritance before her body was even cold. I was going to let him believe he had won. I was going to let him drink his champagne and enjoy his designer cashmere sweaters and post his arrogant photos for the entire world to see. But the absolute second he returned to Portland, I was going to bring his entire fraudulent, entitled reality crashing down around his ears. The funeral director gave a slight, respectful nod, gently signaling the cemetery staff to begin lowering the casket. The mechanical hum of the lowering device filled the quiet, misty air. I turned my back on the grave and walked away across the wet grass, my head held high. My mind was no longer clouded by the heavy, disorienting fog of loss. It was operating with terrifying, absolute clarity. My credit card was completely maxed out. My savings account was completely empty. I had exactly $34 left to my name. But I had something far more valuable than the money Trent had stolen to fund his pathetic illusion of wealth. I had the truth. And I had absolutely nothing left to lose. I drove back to my small apartment, my hands gripping the steering wheel with a new, unshakable certainty. The good, quiet, accommodating Chloe had died in that hospice room right alongside our grandmother. The woman driving the 10-year-old Honda Civic through the Portland rain was someone entirely new. I was going to go directly back to grandmother's house. I was going to tear through every single box pry, open every locked drawer, and read every piece of paper she had left behind. I was going to find out exactly how deep Trent's financial rot went. And then I was going to utterly destroy the golden boy. I drove straight from the wet grass of the cemetery to my grandmother's house in southeast Portland. The freezing rain had finally stopped, but the sky remained a bruised, heavy gray that perfectly matched the crushing weight sitting directly on my chest. Every single time I blinked, I saw the digital display of Mr. Gable's credit card terminal, $9,000. I was a payroll clerk taking home $42,000 a year. That funeral bill was an absolute financial death sentence. I had exactly $34 left in my checking account, and my only credit card was maxed out to its absolute limit. I was completely terrified, running entirely on adrenaline and black coffee, but I knew I could not afford to collapse. Trent was going to come back from Aspen. My older brother, the golden boy, the visionary entrepreneur who had just stolen our grandmother's burial fund to buy designer ski clothes, would eventually fly home. I knew exactly how he operated. He would march right through the front door of this house, declare himself the man of the family, and begin claiming every valuable asset he could get his greedy hands on. He had already promised to reimburse me when he sold her house, casually acting as though the property was already his to liquidate. I had a very narrow, rapidly closing window to secure the house and find a way to survive the massive debt he had forced upon my shoulders. I parked my 10-year-old Honda Civic in the driveway and walked up the concrete steps. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was incredibly still. It smelled exactly the way it always had, a comforting, familiar blend of dried lavender, lemon furniture polish, and old paper. Usually, walking into this house made me feel safe. Today, it felt like a crime scene. I locked the deadbolt behind me, took off my damp wool coat, and walked directly down the hallway toward the small back study. I needed to find a financial miracle. I was desperately hoping to find a forgotten life insurance policy, a stack of old savings bonds, or a hidden cash reserve. Anything to stop the bleeding. My grandmother had been a professional bookkeeper for 40 years. She was a deeply practical woman who respected numbers, balance sheets, and proper documentation. If there was any money left to save me, it would be in her study. The room was perfectly neat. A small reading lamp sat on a polished side table next to a floral-patterned armchair. But my eyes went straight to the massive mahogany desk pushed against the far wall. It was a heavy, imposing piece of furniture she had purchased back in the 1970s. As long as I could remember, the top center drawer of that desk had been firmly locked. When we were children, Trent used to joke that she kept solid gold bars hidden inside. I did not care about gold bars today. I just needed enough money to pay off the funeral home before the interest rates entirely ruined my life. I walked over to the desk and pulled on the brass handle of the center drawer. It held firm, stubbornly locked. I checked the small porcelain bowl where she kept her spare keys, but the desk key was nowhere to be found. I could not afford to be polite anymore. I walked out the back door, crossed the wet lawn to the detached garage, and dug through my late grandfather's rusty red toolbox. I found a heavy cold steel crowbar. Carrying a crowbar into my grandmother's pristine study felt like a terrible violation. It felt deeply wrong, but my desperation was a living, breathing monster inside the room with me. I wedged the flat edge of the cold steel under the lip of the heavy wooden drawer. I took a deep breath, braced my feet against the floor, and pushed down with every single ounce of my body weight. The old mahogany splintered with a loud, violent crack that echoed fiercely through the quiet, empty house. The locking mechanism snapped, and I ripped the heavy drawer completely open. I dropped the crowbar onto the carpet and immediately began pulling things out. My hands were shaking so violently, I kept dropping papers onto the floor. There were neat color-coded stacks of utility bills, property tax receipts, and old birthday cards from me and Trent. I frantically dug through the thick manila folders. I found her life insurance policy, but my heart plummeted directly into my stomach when I read the declaration page. It was a meager basic policy, meant only to cover a few outstanding medical debts. It would pay out less than $2,000. It was absolutely nothing close to what I needed to wipe out the massive funeral debt. Hot, stinging tears of frustration finally spilled over my eyelashes. Panic began to rise rapidly in my throat, threatening to choke me. I had destroyed her beautiful antique desk for absolutely nothing. I was utterly ruined. I pulled the heavy wooden drawer completely out of the desk frame, hoping wildly that an envelope of cash had somehow slipped behind it. I set the broken drawer on the floor. That is when I noticed something strange. The interior cavity of the desk frame was not empty. Tucked securely underneath the bottom wooden panel of the desk, carefully held in place by thick strips of clear packing tape, was a dark green, heavy object. I reached inside the dusty cavity and pulled the tape free. The object fell into my hands with a solid, satisfying weight. It was a thick, dark green, leather-bound accounting ledger. It was the old-fashioned kind with reinforced corners and thick, lined paper. Taped carefully to the very front cover of the dark green book was a heavy brass key. Stamped deeply into the metal of the key was the official logo of Pacific Northwest Bank. I stood completely still, my breathing slowing down. I took the brass key, slipped it securely into the front pocket of my slacks, and carried the heavy green ledger over to the floral-patterned armchair. I sat down, turned on the small reading lamp, and slowly opened the leather cover. The pages inside were filled top to bottom with my grandmother's meticulous, elegant cursive handwriting. She had been a master of numbers, and this dark green book was clearly her final, ultimate accounting. I turned to the very first page. The date at the top corner was over 7 years ago. The first entry was written in crisp blue ink. It read, "Trent initial business loan for restaurant venture, $25,000. Next to the dollar amount was a column clearly labeled Repayment History. The column was completely blank. I turned the page, my breath catching painfully in my throat. The entries continued page after page, year after year, painting a horrifying, undeniable picture of systematic, relentless financial abuse. Trent, rent assistance for downtown luxury apartment, $8,000. Trent legal fees for failed business dispute. $15,000. Trent emergency car repairs for Audi lease, $6,000. I kept turning the heavy pages, adding up the staggering numbers in my head. He had bled her dry for years. While I was clipping coupons and working overtime to pay my own rent, my golden boy brother was funding his grand delusional lifestyle entirely on our grandmother's back. But it was not just the sheer volume of the money that made my blood run absolutely cold. It was the specific details written in the margins. There was an entry dated 4 years ago. It read, Trent unauthorized withdrawal from joint checking account, $4,500. Unauthorized withdrawal. I stared at the words until they blurred. Grandma knew. She had always known. My parents had always painted her as a sweet, slightly confused old woman who just loved spoiling her successful grandson. Trent had always acted like he was a charming, brilliant negotiator who simply knew how to talk her into investing in his visionary ideas. He bragged about how much she believed in him. But the truth was staring me right in the face in dark blue ink. She was never fooled. She was never confused. She knew exactly what he was doing every single time he smiled and lied to her face. I read the small, incredibly detailed notes she had written in the margins of the ledger. Trent asked for an early inheritance payout today. I told him no. He took my debit card while I was sleeping and withdrew the daily maximum from the ATM. I did not confront him. I simply changed the PIN number. I turned to another page, my hands gripping the edges of the book. Trent claimed he needed emergency dental surgery and begged for cash. I called the dental clinic to verify his appointment. They had no record of him. I transferred $5,000 to his account I had anyway, just to see if he would ever tell me the truth about where the money went. He did not. He bought a motorcycle. Tears welled in my eyes again, but this time they were not born of panic or grief. They were born out of a profound, overwhelming awe for the woman who had raised me. She had sat at our chaotic Sunday dinners, quietly eating her roast beef, politely listening to Trent brag loudly about his imaginary corporate wealth, knowing perfectly well that he was nothing more than a common thief. She had let him believe he was a genius who was outsmarting an old woman. She had let him play the role of the golden child for our completely oblivious parents. And all the while, she had patiently, meticulously documented every single stolen cent, building a devastating, undeniable paper trail of his lifelong deceit. I turned to the very last page of the ledger. The paper was crisp. The handwriting was slightly shaky, clearly written as her health was rapidly failing. The date was exactly 3 weeks before she was moved into the hospice facility. The final entry read, Trent believes he has outmaneuvered me. He believes he is the sole beneficiary of this estate because he managed to become the executor of my old will. He thinks I am too blind to see his greed. Let him believe it until the very end. The truth will be in the box. The truth will be in the box. I instinctively reached into the front pocket of my slacks, and my fingers closed tightly around the cold, heavy brass key. Pacific Northwest Bank. I knew exactly where that was. It was a high-security branch located right in the middle of downtown Portland, just a few blocks from my office. My grandmother had not left me completely drowning in debt. She had not abandoned me to face Trent's arrogant wrath entirely alone. She was a brilliant bookkeeper who understood exactly how the world worked. She had spent the last 7 years quietly, brilliantly building an ironclad case against her own grandson, and she had left the ultimate weapon right here in this dark green book for me to find. She knew I would be the one to clean out the house. She knew I would be the practical girl looking for the paperwork. She had planned this perfectly. I slowly closed the green leather book and held it tightly against my chest. The paralyzing fear that had been violently gripping my heart since the funeral home completely dissolved into the quiet air of the study. Trent was currently sitting in a plush leather chair in a luxury ski lodge in Aspen. He was drinking expensive vintage champagne with his awful wife. He was laughing out loud about how incredibly easy it had been to drain our grandmother's burial account while I sat alone with her body. He thought he was completely untouchable. He thought his practical, boring, compliant little sister would just cry, pay the massive funeral bill, and quietly accept absolute defeat like she always did. He had absolutely no idea that our sweet, quiet grandmother had kept the receipts for his entire miserable life. I stood up from the floral armchair, holding the ledger like a shield. I walked out of the ruined study, grabbed my damp wool coat from the hallway hook, and walked out the front door into the brisk afternoon air. The bank was open until 5 o'clock. I had a very important trip to make. The drive to downtown Portland felt like moving through a dream. The freezing rain had finally reduced to a slow and steady drizzle, leaving the city streets slick and gray. I gripped the steering wheel of my 10-year-old Honda Civic so tightly that my fingers cramped. In my passenger seat sat the heavy dark green leather ledger and the cold brass key I had pulled from the ruined mahogany desk. For my entire life, I had believed that my grandmother was a simple, practical woman who saved coupons and kept careful track of her modest grocery bills. I had believed she was a loving victim of my brother's relentless greed, but as I pulled into the underground parking garage of Pacific Northwest Bank, I was beginning to realize that I did not know the depths of the woman who had raised me. I walked into the main lobby of the bank. It was a massive room with high vaulted ceilings, polished marble floors, and an atmosphere of absolute intimidating silence. This was not a standard neighborhood branch where people came to cash small paychecks. This was the Wealth Management and Estate Planning Center. I approached the reception desk, feeling painfully out of place in my damp wool coat and worn-out shoes. I told the receptionist my name and said I needed to access a safe deposit box. She asked for my identification and the key. I handed them over. She typed something into her computer, and her polite customer service smile instantly shifted into an expression of serious professional respect. She softly told me to wait just a moment, explaining that I needed to speak directly with the senior estate attorney on file. Less than 2 minutes later, a man stepped out of the private secure wing. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark tailored suit with sharp silver hair and piercing eyes that seemed to evaluate everything in the room simultaneously. He walked toward me with purpose. I knew immediately that this was not a standard bank manager. This man looked like a shark who had never lost a fight in his life. He extended his hand and introduced himself as Mr. Sterling, the senior legal executor for the Wealth Management Division. He looked down at me with a surprisingly gentle expression and said he had received the formal notification from the hospice facility that morning. He offered his deepest condolences for my loss. Then he looked at the heavy, dark green ledger clutched tightly against my chest. A very small, very sharp smile touched the corners of his mouth. He asked me to follow him into his private office, noting that my grandmother had left extremely specific instructions for this exact day. Mr. Sterling's office was a fortress of dark wood, heavy leather chairs, and towering bookshelves. Through the massive glass window, the gray skyline of Portland looked small and insignificant. I sat down in the leather chair across from his desk. I did not want to waste time. The panic over my maxed-out credit card and the $9,000 funeral bill was still burning hot in my stomach. I placed the green ledger and the brass key onto the center of his immaculate desk. I looked Mr. Sterling straight in the eye and told him I had a massive problem. I told him I went to the funeral home this morning to pay for the burial arrangements using the designated joint account my grandmother had set up. I forced the words out of my tight throat, explaining that the card had declined. I told him my older brother Trent had logged into the banking portal just 2 hours after our grandmother took her final breath. I explained that Trent had completely drained the account executing a wire transfer for nearly $150,000 and was currently spending it at a luxury ski resort in Aspen. I braced myself for Mr. Sterling to look shocked. I fully expected him to express outrage, to frantically pick up his phone to call the fraud department, or to tell me how incredibly sorry he was that my brother had stolen the only money our grandmother had left in this world. Mr. Sterling did none of those things. He simply sat back in his heavy leather chair, steepled his fingers together, and let out a low, deeply satisfied chuckle. I stared at him in complete disbelief. I asked him why he was laughing when my brother had just ruined me financially. Mr. Sterling leaned forward, his piercing eyes locking directly onto mine. He told me that my grandmother was not a fragile, helpless victim of my brother's financial abuse. He said she was one of the most brilliant calculating chess masters he had ever had the absolute privilege of representing. He reached into his locked lower desk drawer and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents bound by a dark blue ribbon. He placed the stack on the desk next to the green ledger. He explained that 3 years ago, my grandmother had come into this exact office. She had brought that same green ledger with her. She had sat in the exact chair I was sitting in and told Mr. Sterling that she knew her grandson was a parasite. She knew Trent was quietly stealing from her, using his charm and her old age as cover. She knew that the absolute second she died, Trent would try to descend upon her house and her assets like a vulture. I listened to his words, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I asked Mr. Sterling what was inside the thick stack of documents. He untied the blue ribbon and opened the heavy file. He told me that my grandmother lived a very modest lifestyle by choice, not by necessity. He revealed that over her 40-year career as a professional bookkeeper, she had made several incredibly shrewd investments in commercial real estate and aggressive mutual funds. She had lived in the same simple house and driven the same old car because she never cared about flashing her wealth, but the wealth was absolutely there. Mr. Sterling looked down at the documents and stated the numbers clearly. He said my grandmother possessed a fully diversified investment portfolio valued at exactly $2.5 million. In addition to that, she owned her home in southeast Portland, completely free and clear. The air vanished from my lungs. I sat frozen in the leather chair. $2.5 million. It was an amount of money I could not even begin to comprehend. We had eaten generic brand cereal and patched our own clothes. We had lived like we were barely scraping by. Mr. Sterling continued his explanation, his voice ringing with absolute legal authority. He said that 3 years ago, my grandmother instructed him to draft a fully insulated, irrevocable trust. An irrevocable trust is a powerful legal fortress. Once an asset is placed inside it, it completely bypasses the standard probate process. It cannot be easily contested by angry relatives. It is totally shielded from the public eye. My grandmother quietly and meticulously transferred the deed to her house, the entirety of her massive investment portfolio, and all her remaining physical assets directly into this trust. I asked him who controlled the trust now that she was gone. Mr. Sterling slid the declaration page across the mahogany desk. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the beneficiary line. The name printed there in bold black ink was mine. Chloe, the quiet daughter, the practical girl, the one who stayed behind to do the heavy lifting while the golden boy chased his ridiculous delusions. I was the sole, exclusive beneficiary of a multi-million-dollar estate. Trent was not entitled to a single penny. He was not entitled to a single square inch of the house. He was legally entirely locked out of the family wealth. Tears of pure, overwhelming shock welled up in my eyes. I looked at the legal document, reading my own name over and over again. But then, the dark, agonizing reality of my current mourning violently crashed back into my mind. I looked up at Mr. Sterling, my voice shaking. I told him that none of this solved the immediate crisis. I explained that I was still sitting on $9,000 of high-interest credit card debt just to put her in the ground. I asked him why, if she had millions of dollars perfectly protected in a trust, she had left the burial account exposed. Why did she leave $150,000 sitting in a basic joint account where Trent could easily snatch it? Mr. Sterling's sharp, predatory smile returned. The intensity in his eyes was absolutely terrifying and completely brilliant. He leaned across the desk, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper. He explained that my grandmother knew Trent's psychology perfectly. She knew that Trent had spent his entire life taking the path of least resistance. She knew his greed would absolutely blind him to common sense. If she had locked every single dollar inside the trust, Trent would have immediately hired an aggressive, sleazy lawyer to contest the estate and drag me into years of exhausting, expensive litigation. She needed to give him something to distract him. She needed to give him enough rope to completely hang himself. The burial account was not an oversight, Mr. Sterling said softly. It was a carefully constructed, meticulously baited trap. I shook my head desperately, trying to follow his logic. I asked how losing $150,000 to a thief was a trap. I pointed out that Trent had still won. He had still stolen the money and was currently spending it on vintage champagne and designer ski gear in Aspen. Mr. Sterling raised a single finger, silencing my panic. He told me to think very carefully about the exact timeline of events. He reminded me that Trent held an active power of attorney for our grandmother, which gave him the legal authority to manage her bank accounts while she was alive and incapacitated in hospice. That is why the bank allowed him to access the portal. That is why he felt so completely confident moving the funds. Trent believed that his status as her legal agent gave him an absolute shield against any accusations of theft. Then, Mr. Sterling dropped the legal hammer. It was a concept so profoundly absolute and unyielding that it completely shifted the axis of my entire reality. He explained that under strict federal and state banking laws, a power of attorney is not a permanent status. The authority granted by a power of attorney dies the exact physical second the principal patient takes their last breath. It does not expire at the end of the business day. It does not expire when the death certificate is officially printed. It expires instantly the moment the heart monitor flatlines. Mr. Sterling pulled out a legal notepad and a pen. He wrote down 2 times. He wrote 3:15 in the morning. Then he wrote 5:15 in the morning. Though, your grandmother passed away at 3:15. He said, his voice cold and precise. At that exact second, your brother Trent ceased to be her legal representative. He became just a regular citizen with absolutely no legal authority over her finances. 2 hours later, at 5:15, he intentionally logged into a secure banking portal. He used credentials that were no longer legally valid to access the account of a deceased person. He then authorized the transfer of nearly $150,000 across state lines into his personal holding account. I sat completely frozen in the heavy leather chair, the crushing weight of his words slowly sinking into my exhausted brain. I realized exactly what he was telling me. Mr. Sterling continued leaning back in his chair with an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. Trent did not just take an early inheritance, Chloe. By accessing a dead woman's bank account and moving funds across state lines for his own personal enrichment, your brother committed active federal wire fraud. He committed grand theft. He committed severe bank fraud. He used the digital banking system to steal from a deceased person. The federal government takes an incredibly harsh stance on individuals who loot the accounts of the dead. The silence in the office was absolute. The grandfather clock in the corner of the room ticked steadily, marking the seconds of my new reality. My brother was not a clever visionary who had outsmarted the probate system. He was a common criminal sitting in a luxury ski resort, completely unaware that he had just committed multiple felonies. He had been so arrogant, so blinded by his own entitlement and his desperate need to fund his fake lifestyle, that he had walked directly into the snare my grandmother had patiently set for him. She had given him the keys to the bait account because she knew he could never resist taking the money. She knew he would not wait for the lawyers. She knew his cowardice would keep him away from the hospital bed, and his greed would drive him straight to the bank. I looked down at the green ledger resting on the desk. My grandmother's meticulous, elegant handwriting was hidden safely inside the leather cover. She had protected me from poverty, shielded the family home from Trent's reckless debt, and handed me the ultimate weapon to ensure he would never, ever be able to exploit another person again. She had not left me holding the bag. She had handed me the sword. Mr. Sterling asked me a very simple, very dangerous question. He asked if I wanted his office to immediately notify Trent of the trust. He asked if I wanted to send a legal warning to Aspen demanding the return of the stolen funds before the bank officially audited the transaction timeline. I thought about my brother hanging up on me in the freezing rain. I thought about him telling me to just put the funeral on my credit card because I was good at budgeting. I thought about Lauren posting photographs of vintage champagne and designer bags while I was standing in the mud watching a pine casket lower into the ground. They had shown me absolutely no mercy. They had discarded me without a second thought. I looked Mr. Sterling right in the eyes. I felt a cold, unbreakable resolve settle deep into my bones. The good, compliant daughter was officially dead and buried. The woman sitting in the leather chair was the executor of my grandmother's final justice. I told him no. I told him not to send a single warning. I instructed him to let Trent keep spending the money. I wanted my brother to buy more champagne. I wanted him to book expensive dinners and purchase luxury items. I wanted him to dig his financial hole so incredibly deep that he would never be able to climb out. I told the terrifying estate attorney that we would wait in absolute silence until Trent returned to Portland to claim the house he thought he owned. Mr. Sterling smiled a genuine expression of profound respect. He opened his pen and slid the trust acceptance documents across the polished mahogany desk. I picked up the pen and signed my name on the solid black line, officially taking ownership of the $2.5 million estate and the house in southeast Portland. The trap was perfectly set, the jaws were locked open, and all I had to do now was wait for the golden boy to come home and step right into it. I sat perfectly still in the heavy leather chair across from Mr. Sterling. The profound silence of his high-rise office felt like a thick blanket wrapping around my exhausted shoulders. For my entire life, I had been the one scrambling to fix things. I was the one making the frantic phone calls, moving the small amounts of money I had, and apologizing for the chaos my older brother constantly created. But in this immaculate room, sitting in front of a brilliant estate attorney who had just handed me the keys to a $2.5 million fortress, the frantic scrambling completely stopped. The panic that had been suffocating me since I stood in the wet grass of the cemetery was completely gone. In its place was a cold, sharp, and absolute stillness. Mr. Sterling folded his hands carefully on top of his polished mahogany desk. He looked at me with an expression of intense professional focus. He gently explained that we were currently standing at a very critical legal crossroads, because we now had concrete digital proof that Trent had initiated a massive unauthorized wire transfer after our grandmother's time of death. We had the legal grounds to act immediately. Mr. Sterling stated that he could draft a formal cease and desist order right then and there. He could contact the fraud department at Pacific Northwest Bank, officially report the theft, and have a federal freeze placed on Trent's personal checking account within the hour. This swift action would lock down whatever stolen funds Trent had not yet managed to spend on his luxury vacation. It was the standard practical and highly recommended legal protocol for securing stolen estate assets. He asked me directly if I wanted him to make that phone call. He asked if I wanted to warn my brother that his fraudulent actions had been discovered and stop him before he caused any further financial damage to the burial account. I did not answer him right away. I slowly reached into the pocket of my damp wool coat and pulled out my smartphone. My thumb hovered over the screen. I opened the Instagram application again. I needed to see it one more time. I needed to look at the exact reality of what my brother and his wife were doing while I was drowning in $9,000 of high-interest credit card debt just to buy our grandmother a simple pine casket. The photograph loaded brightly on my screen. There was Lauren sitting in the private lounge of the St. Regis Aspen Resort. She was draped in expensive winter fabrics, holding her crystal flute of vintage champagne up toward the camera. Her perfectly whitened smile radiated an incredible, sickening level of entitlement. But this time, my eyes completely bypassed her face and locked directly onto the item resting on the rustic wooden table in front of her. It was a pristine, brand new Prada ski bag. It was crafted from heavy black nylon with gleaming gold hardware, aggressively displaying its designer logo for everyone on the internet to admire. I know exactly how much a bag like that costs because I am a practical woman who understands the value of $1. That bag was easily $3,000. $3,000 of my grandmother's carefully saved money. $3,000 that was meant to pay for her funeral service, her floral arrangements, and her final resting place. I stared at that bag, and then I thought about the stark, quiet reality of the funeral I had just attended. I thought about the cheap white carnations I had been forced to substitute because I could not afford the imported white roses my grandmother had loved. I thought about the empty chairs on the family side of the church sanctuary. I thought about the agonizing humiliation I had endured in the funeral director's office when the burial card declined. I thought about Trent's arrogant laughing voice on the phone, casually telling me to put my grandmother's burial on my own credit card because he and Lauren needed a mental health break from the stress. The quiet, compliant, good daughter I had been for 32 years finally and completely evaporated. I did not feel an ounce of sisterly obligation. I did not feel the urge to protect him from the consequences of his own horrific greed. I looked at the photograph of the Prada bag bought with funeral money, and a profound, unshakable sense of justice settled deep into my bones. I set the phone face up on the mahogany desk and pushed it slightly toward Mr. Sterling. He glanced down at the screen, taking in the image of the champagne, the luxury resort, and the designer bag. His sharp, predatory eyes darted back up to meet mine. He did not say a word, but his silence told me he completely understood. No. I told Mr. Sterling, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. Do not call the bank. Do not send a cease and desist order. Do not give him a single warning. Mr. Sterling raised a single, perfectly groomed eyebrow. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair and asked me to confirm my decision, reminding me that every dollar Trent spent was a dollar that might be incredibly difficult to recover later, especially since Trent had a long history of living far beyond his actual means. I looked Mr. Sterling right in the eye. I want him to keep spending, I said firmly. I want him to buy expensive dinners. I want him to book luxury spa treatments. I want him to swipe that stolen money every single chance he gets. Let him dig the hole so deep he can never climb out. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across Mr. Sterling's face. It was the smile of a brilliant attorney who realized his client had the exact same ruthless clarity as her late grandmother. He nodded slowly, fully comprehending the beautiful, devastating trap we were about to spring. He explained that by allowing Trent to continue his spending spree across state lines, we were not just letting him waste money, we were letting him actively compound his own federal crimes. Every separate transaction he made with those stolen funds every time he swiped his card in Aspen was a fresh count of wire fraud. He was systematically building an undeniable documented paper trail of his own grand theft. If we warned him now, he might panic, return the remaining funds, and try to claim it was all a simple misunderstanding regarding his expired power of attorney. But if we let him burn through the cash on luxury items and vintage champagne, he could never claim ignorance. He was cementing his own absolute ruin. We will proceed exactly as you wish, Chloe, Mr. Sterling said softly. We wait in complete silence. He then pulled the thick stack of trust documents toward him and uncapped his gold fountain pen. It was time to formalize the transfer of power. For my entire life, I had been completely excluded from the financial decisions of my family. I had never been trusted with anything other than cleaning up their messes and managing the dirty, practical details they found too boring to handle. Now, I was about to take legal possession of an empire. Mr. Sterling walked me through the paperwork with meticulous care. He explained the structure of the irrevocable trust my grandmother had brilliantly designed. He showed me the exact clauses that protected the $2.5 million investment portfolio and the deed to the property in Southeast Portland. He pointed out the specific language that permanently barred Trent from ever contesting the estate. My grandmother had thought of absolutely everything. She had anticipated every single lie my brother might tell, and she had built a legal wall so incredibly high that he would never be able to scale it. I took the heavy gold pen from Mr. Sterling. My hand did not shake. For the first time in days, I felt grounded, anchored to the earth by the weight of my grandmother's incredible trust in me. I signed the documents one by one. The scratch of the pen on the thick, high-quality paper was the only sound in the vast office. With every signature, I felt the heavy, suffocating burden of my past lifting away. I was no longer the invisible, unappreciated workhorse. I was the sole executor and beneficiary of my grandmother's legacy. When the final document was signed and properly notarized by his assistant, Mr. Sterling closed the blue folder. He looked at me with a profound, quiet respect. "You are the legal owner of the house now, Chloe," he said. "You hold all the cards. I strongly advise you to secure your property immediately." I thanked him, shook his hand, and walked out of the towering bank building into the fading light of the Portland afternoon. The rain had completely stopped, leaving the city streets clean and smelling of wet pine. I drove my old Honda Civic back across the river, heading straight for the house in southeast Portland. The house that was now entirely mine. As I pulled into the familiar driveway, I looked at the property with new eyes. It was a sturdy, beautifully maintained craftsman home. It held 32 years of my memories. It was the place where I had learned to bake, the place where I had done my homework at the kitchen table, the place where my grandmother had quietly and patiently observed the true nature of her family. Trent believed this house belonged to him. He had already promised to sell it to pay off his massive debts. He had treated my grandmother's death as a real estate opportunity. I walked up the concrete steps and unlocked the front door. The very first thing I did was pick up my phone and call a local locksmith I found online. I requested emergency same-day service. I did not care how much it cost. I had exactly $34 left in my bank account, but I still had a small amount of available credit on a secondary store card, and I was going to use every last cent of it to secure my fortress. The locksmith arrived 45 minutes later. He was an older, quiet man with a weathered face and a heavy tool belt. I stood on the porch and watched as he methodically removed the old, worn brass deadbolts from the front and back doors. Those old locks had granted Trent free access to this house for his entire life. He had always walked through those doors like a conquering king, demanding food, demanding money, demanding attention. I listened to the satisfying metallic click as the locksmith installed the heavy, brand-new, high-security deadbolts. I watched him test the mechanisms, making sure they engaged with a solid, undeniable clunk. When he was finished, he handed me a set of 3 shiny new silver keys. The metal felt cold and heavy in my palm. It felt like absolute security. After the locksmith drove away, I began the meticulous process of the silent prep. I knew exactly how Trent operated, and I knew how to set the stage perfectly. If he drove up and saw major changes to the house, his natural paranoia might kick in. He might sense a trap and call his own sleazy lawyers before setting foot on the property. I needed him to believe that absolutely nothing had changed. I needed him to walk into this ambush completely blinded by his own towering arrogance. I walked through the house carefully, ensuring that the exterior looked exactly the same as it had for the last 20 years. I left the curtains drawn in the front windows exactly the way my grandmother always kept them. I made sure her old gardening shoes were still sitting on the back porch. I left the porch light on its usual automatic timer. From the street, the house looked like the quiet, undefended property of a deceased old woman, patiently waiting for the eldest son to come and claim it. Inside, I prepared my space. I gathered all the crucial paperwork, the dark green ledger, the trust documents, and the bank records showing Trent's fraudulent wire transfer. I placed them in a neat, organized stack on the coffee table in the center of the living room. I moved the floral-patterned armchair to a specific angle, ensuring I would have a clear, commanding view of the front door. Then, I sat down in the quiet house to wait. The silence was not lonely. It was heavy with anticipation. For the next several days, I went back to my own apartment, only to sleep and shower, returning to the house every morning to maintain my vigil. I drank tea from my grandmother's favorite ceramic mug. I walked through the rooms, tracing my fingers over the antique furniture Trent was undoubtedly already planning to sell to the highest bidder. I did not turn on the television. I did not play any music. I just sat in the profound quiet, gathering my strength, letting the anger crystallize into a weapon I was fully prepared to use. I thought about Lauren drinking champagne in Aspen. I thought about the $3,000 Prada ski bag. I thought about Trent laughing at me in the freezing rain, telling me I was good at budgeting and ordering me to figure out how to bury our grandmother on my own dime. He had spent his entire life taking from us. He had taken my parents' attention, he had taken my grandmother's money, and he had taken my peace of mind. He thought he could simply take this house too. But the locks were changed, the trust was signed, The trap was meticulously, flawlessly baited. Trent was currently flying high on stolen money, completely unaware that his wings were already clipped. He was going to come back to Portland acting like the lord of the manor, ready to evict me and list the property. He was going to try to turn his key in the door. He was going to demand entry. I sat in the floral armchair, watching the afternoon shadows stretch across the hardwood floor. I was no longer the practical, compliant sister. I was the master of this house, and I was absolutely ready for the golden boy to come home. 7 agonizing days passed since I stood in the towering glass office of the estate attorney and signed the documents that made me the legal owner of my grandmother's house. 7 days of absolute deafening silence from my brother. I spent that week living in a strange, suspended reality. I took a formal leave of absence from my payroll job. I spent my mornings walking through the quiet, familiar rooms of the house in Southeast Portland, carefully organizing the physical remnants of a beautiful, modest life. I spent my afternoons sitting in the floral patterned armchair in the front living room, staring out the large bay window at the street, mentally preparing for the inevitable storm I knew was coming. I did not watch television. I barely slept. I existed on a relentless diet of black coffee and the cold, hard fuel of my own righteous anger. I knew Trent. I knew his rhythms, his towering arrogance, and his absolute predictability. I knew he would stay at the luxury resort in Aspen just long enough to drain the absolute last drop of pleasure out of his stolen funds. He would drink the vintage champagne, he would ski on the fresh snow, and he would completely ignore the grim reality of the funeral happening back home. And then, the exact second he felt he had suitably recovered from the stress of a death he did not even witness, he would come straight back to Portland to liquidate the rest of what he firmly believed was his inherent right. The ambush came on a Tuesday morning. It was a bleak, dreary day, exactly 1 week and 1 day after our grandmother passed away. The heavy Portland rain had returned, washing the suburban neighborhood in a cold, unforgiving gray. Most of the neighbors had already left for their morning commutes, leaving the street incredibly quiet. I was sitting by the front window, a warm ceramic mug of coffee resting in my hands, when I heard the distinct, aggressive purr of a high-performance engine rolling down the wet asphalt. I pulled the heavy fabric of the curtain back just a fraction of an inch to look outside. A brand new, gleaming black Audi SUV pulled sharply into the driveway, its wide tires ruthlessly crushing the wet, fallen leaves against the concrete. It was clearly a leased vehicle, undoubtedly secured the moment Trent and Lauren landed back in Oregon. Financed entirely by the grand illusion of the massive estate Trent thought he was about to sell to the highest bidder. The engine cut off and the heavy doors swung open. Trent stepped out of the driver's side first, followed immediately by his wife, Lauren. I watched them closely, my stomach tightening with a mixture of absolute disgust and quiet anticipation. They were putting on a masterful, highly coordinated performance for anyone who might be watching from the neighboring houses. They were both dressed in head-to-toe black, projecting the somber image of a grieving, devastated family. Trent wore a sharp, dark designer suit with a perfectly knotted black tie, his head bowed low in a pathetic pantomime of profound sorrow. Lauren wore a sleek, expensive black cashmere coat that fell elegantly to her knees. Her blonde hair was styled perfectly, and she wore oversized black designer sunglasses, supposedly to hide the devastating tears she was shedding. Draped casually over her forearm was the exact same $3,000 Prada ski bag she had proudly showcased on her social media feed just a week earlier in Aspen. That bag was paid for with the money meant for my grandmother's casket. They paused together on the wet driveway, standing incredibly close, holding hands as if they were supporting each other through an unbearable, crushing tragedy. I watched them perform their fake grief for an audience of empty houses and wet lawns. They had not shed a single genuine tear when it actually mattered. They had completely abandoned me. They had not attended the beautiful, quiet funeral. They had not paid a single bill, but here they were, proudly wearing the uniform of mourning, fully ready to step into the highly profitable role of the tragic, wealthy heirs. Trent placed his hand gently on the small of Lauren's back, guiding her up the front concrete steps with practiced performative care. I stepped away from the window and walked quietly into the center of the living room. I planted my feet firmly on the hardwood floor and stood perfectly still. I heard their expensive leather shoes step heavily onto the wooden boards of the front porch. I heard the familiar metallic jingle of Trent's key ring. He had carried the key to this house since he was a teenager, always treating the property as his personal hotel and his ultimate financial backup plan. I held my breath, waiting for the exact moment his fraudulent reality would violently collide with the truth. I heard the metal key slide smoothly into the keyhole. Then, I heard the dull, heavy, unyielding clunk of mechanical failure as the grooves of his old key completely failed to catch the pins of the brand new high-security deadbolt I had installed just days prior. I heard Trent jiggle the brass handle. The heavy wooden door remained completely locked and utterly unyielding. I heard him pull the key out, mutter a sharp curse under his breath, and forcefully shove the key back into the lock. He violently wiggled the handle, the metallic rattling sound echoing sharply through the quiet foyer. When the door refused to yield a second time, the performative grief instantly vanished from the front porch. The illusion of the heartbroken grandson shattered into a million pieces the absolute second he faced a minor inconvenience. The gentle jiggling rapidly turned into heavy, aggressive pounding. Trent slammed his closed fist violently against the solid wood of the front door, the heavy thuds vibrating through the floorboards beneath my feet. "Chloe," he shouted through the heavy door. His voice was no longer somber or grieving. It was muffled by the thick wood, but dripping with familiar, impatient annoyance. "Chloe, open the door. The lock is stuck. Open up right now." I took a deep, steadying breath. I smoothed the front appuy of my practical, inexpensive gray slacks. I walked slowly and deliberately through the living room and into the small foyer. I reached out my fingers, confidently wrapping around the cold brass of the new deadbolt, and smoothly turned it. I pulled the heavy door open. Trent stood on the welcome mat, his face flushed red with immediate entitled irritation. Lauren stood slightly behind him, crossing her arms over her expensive cashmere coat, looking at me with absolute, undisguised disdain. Neither of them offered a greeting. Neither of them asked how I was holding up after burying our grandmother entirely alone. Neither of them mentioned the funeral they had entirely skipped. Trent immediately pushed aggressively past me, stepping forcefully into the foyer without waiting for a single word of invitation. He pulled off his wetsuit jacket and threw it casually over the wooden banister, treating the house exactly as he always had. "What did you do to the front lock?" he demanded. Not even looking at me as he walked straight past the foyer and into the living room to quickly inspect the space. I had to practically break my wrist trying to get the key to turn. "You need to call a locksmith and get that fixed today. I have an appraiser coming in exactly 1 hour." I stood in the foyer, watching him pace through the living room like a wealthy corporate buyer inspecting a newly acquired asset. "An appraiser?" I asked, keeping my voice incredibly calm, flat, and completely devoid of any emotion. "Yes, an appraiser," Trent snapped, turning to face me with a look of supreme, absolute condescension. "A real estate professional, Chloe. Someone who is going to tell me exactly how much my house is worth before I put it on the market." Lauren and I have already spoken to a premier broker in the Pearl District. The housing market is incredibly hot right now, and we are not going to waste any time sitting on a vacant property while it depreciates. We want this place aggressively listed and entirely sold by the end of the month. Lauren stepped past me, her high heels clicking loudly and obnoxiously against the hardwood floor. She took off her oversized sunglasses, revealing cold, calculating eyes that completely lacked any trace of sorrow or humanity. She looked around my grandmother's meticulously kept living room and let out a heavy, incredibly dramatic sigh. "This place smells like old dust and cheap potpourri," Lauren complained visibly, wrinkling her nose as she looked at the beautiful antique furniture my grandmother had cherished for decades. "Trent, we are going to have to pay a professional staging company to come in here and completely modernize this entire space. Nobody is going to pay top dollar for a house that looks like a 1980s nursing home. We have to rip up these carpets immediately." Trent nodded in vigorous agreement, pulling his expensive smartphone from his pocket to hastily check the time. "You are exactly right, Lauren," he said, completely ignoring my presence in the room, as if I were simply a piece of the outdated furniture. "We need to clear out all of this junk before the staging team gets here next week." He finally turned his attention back to me, adopting the authoritative, commanding tone he always used when delegating his heavy responsibilities onto my tired shoulders. "Listen to me very carefully, Chloe," he said, pointing a rigid finger directly at my chest. "I do not have the time to hold your hand through this process. I'm a very busy man with a lot of moving parts to manage right now. I need you to go upstairs, right now, grab some heavy-duty trash bags, and start packing up your things. After you do that, I want you to start boxing up all of grandmother's junk in the kitchen and the back bedrooms. Keep anything you think is actually worth selling at an estate sale and throw the absolute rest away. I want this entire house completely empty, spotless, and broom swept by Sunday evening. Do you understand me?" I did not answer him immediately. I simply looked at him. I looked at this man who had shared my childhood, who had grown up in this very house, eating warm meals at the kitchen table, just a few feet away from where we stood. I looked at the dark designer suit he had purchased with money meant for a coffin. I looked at the expensive, glowing ski tan fading on his cheeks. I looked at the absolute, blind entitlement radiating from every single pore of his body. He truly believed he was the undisputed master of this domain. He truly believed I was nothing more than the hired help, the practical, boring girl whose only purpose in life was to quietly facilitate his grand delusional vision of wealth and status. I walked slowly past him, stepping deeply into the center of the living room. I did not go upstairs to pack my things. I did not go to the kitchen to gather heavy-duty trash bags. I walked directly over to the floral-patterned armchair, the exact chair my grandmother had sat in every single evening to read her books and quietly observe the truth of her family. I sat down on the soft cushions. I picked up the ceramic mug of black coffee I had left resting on the polished side table. I brought the warm ceramic gently to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. The dark, bitter liquid grounded me, steadying the incredibly powerful surge of adrenaline currently coursing through my veins. Trent crossed his arms over his chest, his face twisting into an ugly scowl of profound, angry impatience. "Did you not hear a single word I just said, Chloe?" he demanded, stepping aggressively closer to the armchair, looming over me to force his authority. "The appraiser will be here in less than an hour. I gave you a direct order. You need to start clearing out this house, right now." I lowered the ceramic coffee mug back down to the polished side table with a soft, quiet clink. I looked up at my older brother, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact. The air in the room felt perfectly still, completely devoid of the panic, the fear, and the submissiveness that had defined my entire existence in this family for 32 years. I let a few seconds of heavy, agonizing silence stretch between us, allowing his arrogant demands to hang uselessly and pathetically in the quiet space. Then, with a voice as calm, cold, and entirely unyielding as a steel blade, I simply said one word. No. The single word hung in the air of my grandmother's quiet living room. No. It was a simple word, a short word, but it was a word I had never once used with my older brother in my entire 32 years of life. Trent stared down at me, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly parted. For a long, heavy moment, his brain simply could not process what he had just heard. He actually looked behind him, glancing at his wife Lauren, as if to confirm that I had spoken out loud. Lauren just stood there in her expensive black cashmere coat, gripping her stolen Prada bag, staring at me with a mixture of absolute confusion and deep disgust. Trent turned his attention back to me. A harsh, mocking laugh escaped his throat. He shook his head, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He told me I was clearly having a mental breakdown. He said the stress of the funeral I had planned all by myself had obviously driven me completely crazy. He adopted a tone that a person might use with a stubborn toddler. He told me to stop playing games, to get up out of the armchair, and to go upstairs to pack my bags. He said he was not going to ask me again. I did not move a single muscle. I sat comfortably in the floral-patterned armchair, feeling the solid, grounding warmth of the ceramic coffee mug in my hands. I looked right through him. The immense, terrifying power of knowing the absolute truth was coursing through my veins. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to argue with him. I simply took another slow sip of my dark coffee and continued to sit in perfect, unyielding silence. Trent let out a loud, frustrated groan. He threw his hands up in the air and turned to his wife. He loudly declared that I had completely lost my mind and that they were just going to have to ignore me until I snapped out of it. He told Lauren the real estate appraiser was going to be arriving any minute and they needed to focus on the massive payday waiting for them. Lauren nodded eagerly, her eyes already scanning the living room, mentally calculating the dollar value of every single item my grandmother had spent a lifetime collecting. 10 minutes later, a silver BMW pulled sharply into the driveway, parking right behind Trent's leased Audi. I watched through the front bay window as a man stepped out of the vehicle. He was wearing a highly tailored navy suit, bright brown leather shoes, and holding a sleek leather clipboard. His hair was slicked back, and his teeth were unnaturally white. He looked exactly like the kind of aggressive, fast-talking real estate agent who specialized in flipping properties for maximum immediate profit. Trent rushed to the front door, his previous anger instantly evaporating. He completely dropped the grieving grandson act and seamlessly transitioned into his favorite role. He was now the wealthy, visionary entrepreneur holding the keys to a massive real estate empire. He pulled the heavy wooden door open and warmly welcomed the agent inside, shaking his hand with exaggerated, arrogant enthusiasm. The agent introduced himself as Bradley. Bradley stepped into the foyer, rubbing his hands together. He looked around the entryway, his eyes lighting up with undisguised greed. He told Trent that homes in the specific Southeast Portland neighborhood were currently selling for incredible amounts of money. He said developers were desperate for properties with good bones and original features. Trent beamed with pride, acting as though he had built the house himself. He invited Bradley to start the grand tour. They walked heavily through the hallway and into the living room, their expensive shoes loudly clicking against the original oak hardwood floors. Trent began boasting about the structural integrity of the house. He talked loudly about knocking down the interior walls to create an open concept layout. He pointed at the beautiful hand-crafted molding near the ceiling and casually suggested tearing it all down to modernize the space for wealthy tech buyers. I sat quietly in my armchair, watching the two men pace back and forth across my property. Trent brushed past my chair 3 different times deliberately, ignoring my presence, acting as if I were simply a squatter taking up space in his newly acquired kingdom. He spoke about my grandmother's beloved home like it was nothing more than a profitable carcass, ready to be picked completely clean. While Trent and Bradley measured the square footage and calculated their massive profit margins, Lauren decided it was time to take inventory of the interior assets. She unzipped her designer purse and pulled out a thick pad of bright neon pink sticky notes and a thick black marker. She began walking slowly through the living room, tapping her expensive high heels against the floorboards. I watched her approach the tall grandfather clock standing in the corner of the room. My grandfather had built that clock entirely by hand in 1972. He had meticulously carved the dark wood and calibrated the heavy brass pendulums himself. It was my grandmother's most treasured possession. Lauren did not look at the craftsmanship. She did not consider the profound history. She simply scribbled a $sign on a neon pink sticky note and slapped it aggressively right onto the center of the beautiful glass face. She moved to the vintage mahogany dining table, where our family had eaten every Thanksgiving dinner for my entire life. She slapped another bright pink square right in the middle of the polished wood. She walked over to the antique china cabinet, the one holding the delicate teacups my grandmother had brought over from Ireland. Lauren plastered a pink note directly onto the glass door. Every single bright pink square felt like a physical slap to my grandmother's memory. It was an absolute, unforgivable desecration of the life she had built. Lauren turned around and looked at me sitting in the chair. She dramatically rolled her eyes and let out a heavy sigh. She loudly complained to Trent that they were going to have to hire an expensive estate sale company to drag all of this heavy junk out of the house. She said it was going to be an absolute nightmare trying to empty the property before the open house. I did not say a word. I did not flinch. I just sat perfectly still, observing the unbelievable magnitude of their greed. I was letting them dig the hole. Every arrogant word they spoke, every sticky note Lauren placed, every grand plan Trent discussed with the real estate agent was just another shovel full of dirt they were throwing over their own heads. Eventually, Bradley finished tapping his knuckles against the walls and taking notes on his clipboard. He turned around to summarize his initial findings for Trent, and that was the exact moment he finally noticed me sitting silently in the floral armchair in the corner of the room. Bradley stopped talking mid-sentence. He looked at me, then looked at Trent with a highly confused expression. He pointed his pen in my direction and asked Trent if I was a difficult tenant who needed to be formally evicted before they could list the property for sale. Trent's face flushed with immediate, profound embarrassment. The charming, wealthy entrepreneur facade completely slipped. He looked at me, and his eyes burned with an intense, unbridled fury. He hated being questioned. He hated looking foolish in front of a man he was desperately trying to impress. He quietly asked Bradley to excuse him for just one moment. Trent marched directly across the living room carpet. He stopped right in front of my chair. He leaned over, using his significant physical size to try and cast a shadow over me. It was an intimidation tactic he had used on me since we were teenagers. I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the sharp scent of his rising sweat. A thick blue vein was pulsing visibly in his neck. He pointed his finger just inches from my face. He lowered his voice to a vicious, threatening hiss, hoping to keep his words away from the real estate agent's ears. "What is your absolute problem?" he demanded, his voice trembling with contained rage. "You are humiliating me in front of a top-tier broker. I told you to go upstairs and pack your bags. I told you to get out of my sight." I looked up at him, my expression perfectly blank. "I am enjoying my coffee, Trent," I said softly. Trent's face twisted into an ugly, hateful sneer. He slammed his hand down hard onto the small wooden side table next to me, making my ceramic mug rattle against the polished wood. He leaned down even closer, his face practically touching mine. "You listen to me right now," he hissed. "You are just a payroll clerk, Chloe. You have absolutely no idea how the real world works. This is grown-up business. There is millions of dollars at stake here, and I am not going to let a boring, pathetic little practical girl ruin my massive payday." He straightened his posture, puffing out his chest, completely secure in his absolute delusion of authority. He crossed his arms and looked down at me like I was a piece of trash he had found on his shoe. "I am giving you exactly one last chance to stand up, walk out the back door, and disappear," he said. "If you do not get up and leave my property right this second, I am going to call the Portland police. I will tell them you are an unwanted squatter. I will have you forcibly removed and formally trespassed from this property. You will leave in handcuffs if you push me. Now get out of my house." "Get out of my house!" The words echoed in the quiet living room. For 32 years, I had allowed this man to dictate my entire reality. I'd allowed my parents to convince me that I was less important, less valuable, and entirely disposable. I had drained my bank account to cover up his selfish mistakes. I had stood in the freezing rain, feeling completely broken while he drank champagne, but sitting in that chair, listening to him threaten to call the police to remove me from a house that legally belonged entirely to me. I felt a profound, overwhelming wave of peace. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not try to argue with him. I slowly reached out and picked up my ceramic coffee mug. I brought it to my lips and took one final deliberate sip. I set the mug back down on the table with a soft final clink. I slowly turned my wrist and looked down at my watch. The time was exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I looked back up at my older brother. His face was bright red, his chest heaving with arrogant anger, completely expecting me to finally break lower my head and quietly scurry out the back door, just like the obedient workhorse I had always been. "You can call the police if you want, Trent," I said. My voice was perfectly clear, completely calm, and absolutely terrifying in its certainty. "But I think you should wait for my guest." Trent's face scrunched in deep confusion. His arms dropped slowly to his sides. He opened his mouth to ask me what on earth I was talking about. Before he could form a single word, the heavy brass knocker on the front door sounded twice. It was a loud, firm, commanding sound that shattered the tense atmosphere of the room. It was the sound of absolute, inescapable reality finally arriving on the front porch. Lauren jumped, slightly startled by the sudden noise. Bradley, the real estate agent, turned toward the foyer, looking completely bewildered by the unfolding family drama. Trent stared at the front door, his confident posture finally beginning to crack under the weight of sudden, unexplained uncertainty. I stood up slowly from the floral-patterned armchair. I smoothed the front of my gray slacks, ignoring my brother entirely. I walked past him, my footsteps light and steady against the hardwood floor. I stepped into the foyer, reached out, and confidently grasped the heavy brass handle of the new high-security deadbolt. I pulled the heavy wooden door wide open. Standing on the front porch, perfectly illuminated by the gray afternoon light, was the fiercely intimidating estate attorney. Mr. Sterling was wearing an impeccable dark charcoal suit. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his sharp, predatory eyes immediately swept past me to lock directly onto my brother. In his right hand, Mr. Sterling was carrying a thick, heavy leather briefcase. It was the exact briefcase that contained the certified, signed trust documents. It was the exact briefcase that contained the digital proof of Trent's massive federal wire fraud. It was the briefcase that contained the absolute immediate end of my brother's entire privileged existence. I stepped back, smiled a very small, very cold smile, and invited the attorney inside. Mr. Sterling stepped over the threshold and into the small foyer of my grandmother's house. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that completely commanded the space. The absolute second his expensive leather shoes touched the hardwood floor, he did not bother to wipe his feet on the welcome mat. He simply stood there, an imposing figure in his dark charcoal suit, holding his thick leather briefcase at his side. His sharp silver hair caught the dim light coming through the front door, and his piercing eyes immediately locked onto Trent. Trent stared at the older man, his arrogant, flushed face twisting into a mask of deep confusion. The heavy brass knocker had interrupted his vicious rant, and he was clearly struggling to regain his footing. He looked Mr. Sterling up and down, taking in the tailored suit and the incredibly expensive briefcase. Trent was a man who worshipped the appearance of wealth, and he instinctively recognized that the man standing in the foyer possessed a level of power and money that he could only ever dream of faking. But Trent was also blinded by his own towering entitlement. He puffed out his chest, completely convinced that he was still the undisputed lord of this manor. "Excuse me," Trent said, his voice loud and artificially deep. "I do not believe we have an appointment. This is a private residence, and we are currently in the middle of a very important real estate appraisal. You cannot just walk in here. Who exactly are you, and what are you doing in my house?" Mr. Sterling did not answer him immediately. He did not offer his hand for a polite greeting. He simply let a long, suffocating silence stretch across the room. He looked at Trent the way a scientist might look at a particularly unpleasant insect under a microscope. Then his cold, calculating gaze slowly swept across the living room. He looked at the beautiful grandfather clock in the corner. He looked at the antique china cabinet. He noted the obnoxious, bright neon pink sticky notes that Lauren had plastered all over my grandmother's most treasured possessions. A tiny, incredibly sharp muscle twitched right at the corner of Mr. Sterling's jaw. Finally, Mr. Sterling turned his attention to Bradley, the slick real estate agent who was still standing awkwardly near the hallway, tightly gripping his leather clipboard. "You are a licensed real estate broker in the state of Oregon?" Mr. Sterling asked. His voice was perfectly level, but it carried a deep, resonant authority that made the air in the room feel incredibly heavy. Bradley blinked, completely taken aback by the sudden question. He adjusted his brightly polished shoes and offered a hesitant, forced smile. "Yes, sir," Bradley said quickly. "I am a premier broker for the Pearl District. I was just brought in today to give a preliminary valuation on this property for Mr. Trent here. He is looking to list the estate as soon as possible." Mr. Sterling nodded slowly. He stepped fully into the living room, leaving the front door open behind him. He did not ask to sit down. He did not ask to take off his coat. He stood right in the center of the room, an absolute pillar of legal intimidation. "Then I strongly advise you to pack up your clipboard and leave this property immediately," Mr. Sterling said softly. His tone was perfectly pleasant, but it held the devastating weight of a direct threat. "You are currently trespassing on private property, sir. If you attempt to process a single piece of paperwork regarding the sale listing or valuation of this house, I will personally see to it that your broker's license is permanently revoked by the state board before the end of the business week." Bradley physically recoiled. His unnaturally white smile completely vanished. He looked frantically at Trent, then back at Mr. Sterling, his eyes wide with sudden panic. Trent stepped forward, his face turning an ugly, mottled shade of purple. "Now you wait just a minute," Trent shouted, throwing his hands in the air. "You do not come into my house and threaten my broker. I am the executor of this estate. I am in charge here. Bradley, you stay exactly where you are. This old man is clearly a friend of my crazy sister. She is just trying to cause drama because she is bitter." Mr. Sterling slowly turned his head to look at my brother. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Trent," he said, using my brother's first name with a casual disrespect that made Trent visibly flinch. "I am Mr. Sterling. I am the senior legal executor for the Wealth Management Division of Pacific Northwest Bank. I represent the sole exclusive owner of this entire estate, and the owner of this estate did not invite this real estate agent inside." Bradley did not need to hear another word. He recognized the name of the bank, and he recognized the absolute unyielding tone of a senior corporate attorney who could easily destroy his entire career with a single phone call. Bradley swallowed hard completely, ignoring Trent's furious demands to stay. He tucked his pen behind his ear, clutched his leather clipboard tightly to his chest, and practically ran toward the open front door. "I am so sorry for the intrusion." Bradley stammered awkwardly, sliding past Mr. Sterling without making eye contact. "I was just leaving. I will strike this address from my records immediately." "Have a good afternoon." The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind the fleeing real estate agent. The sound echoed loudly in the tense, quiet living room. Trent stood frozen in the center of the room, his chest heaving with absolute unbridled rage. He had just been completely humiliated in front of a man he was desperately trying to impress. His grand, immediate plan to liquidate my grandmother's house had just been derailed by a man he did not even know. He turned his furious, burning eyes directly onto me. He completely ignored Mr. Sterling and marched over to the floral-patterned armchair where I was still comfortably sitting. "What is your absolute problem, Chloe?" Trent screamed, the veins in his neck bulging violently against his stiff, white collar. "You bring a bank lawyer into my house to scare off my broker. You think you can just hire some cheap suit to intimidate me. I am the eldest grandson. I am the executor of her will. I have her power of attorney. I have every single legal right to sell this junk and list this property, and you have absolutely nothing." Lauren stepped up right beside him, her expensive black cashmere coat swishing around her knees. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, glaring at me with pure, unadulterated venom. She completely forgot her performance of the grieving, heartbroken wife. "You are being incredibly selfish, Chloe." Lauren snapped, her voice shrill and grating in the quiet room. "Trent is just trying to manage this massive burden for the family. We have already spent our own money to fly back here and deal with this mess. We deserve to be compensated for our time and our stress. You need to tell your little lawyer friend to leave right now, before Trent calls the police and has you both arrested." I did not say a word. I did not need to defend myself. I looked past my screaming brother and his greedy wife, focusing my attention entirely on the incredibly calm man standing in the center of the room. Mr. Sterling had not moved a single inch. He stood perfectly still, watching Trent and Lauren throw their childish, entitled tantrums with a look of mild, clinical fascination. When Lauren finally stopped yelling, Mr. Sterling slowly reached down and placed his thick leather briefcase directly onto the polished surface of the vintage mahogany dining table, the very same table Lauren had just desecrated with a bright pink sticky note. The loud, sharp snap of the twin brass locks echoing through the living room instantly silenced Trent. My brother turned his head, his eyes drawn to the expensive leather briefcase like a magnet. He watched as Mr. Sterling slowly opened the top flap and reached inside. "I am not here representing your sister, Mr. Trent." The attorney said smoothly, pulling a thick stack of heavy legal documents bound by a dark blue ribbon from the depths of his briefcase. "I am here executing the direct, explicit, and legally binding instructions of your late grandmother. Instructions she carefully laid out in my office exactly 3 years ago." Trent's arrogant posture faltered for just a fraction of a second, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. 3 years ago, he repeated, his voice losing some of its aggressive volume. "What are you talking about? My grandmother did not have a bank attorney. She used a cheap local guy in a strip mall to write her will 10 years ago. I am the executor on that paperwork. I have the copies in my bag right now. Mr. Sterling offered a small, incredibly cold smile. That will is completely null and void, he explained gently, placing the thick stack of documents squarely on the dining table. Your grandmother was a remarkably brilliant woman, Trent. She was a professional bookkeeper who understood exactly how money assets and human greed truly operated. She knew that a standard will would simply invite you to drag this family through years of exhausting, expensive probate court. She knew you would try to bleed the estate dry with legal fees just to force a settlement. So she did not leave her assets in a will. Mr. Sterling untied the dark blue ribbon with incredibly slow, deliberate precision. Trent watched his hands, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Lauren uncrossed her arms, her manicured fingers nervously gripping the handle of her stolen Prada bag. 3 years ago, Mr. Sterling continued, his voice echoing with absolute terrifying authority. Your grandmother established a fully insulated, totally shielded, irrevocable trust. An irrevocable trust completely bypasses the probate process. It cannot be contested. It cannot be challenged by angry relatives holding outdated paperwork. Once an asset is placed inside this specific legal fortress, it belongs entirely and exclusively to the named beneficiary. Trent took a slow step backward. The blood began to rapidly drain from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly shade of gray. His eyes darted nervously between me, the attorney, and the thick stack of papers on the table. What assets? Trent demanded, his voice suddenly sounding very small and incredibly fragile. What did she put in the trust? She only had this old house and a meager little checking account. Mr. Sterling picked up the top document. It was printed on heavy cream-colored paper, stamped with an official gold notary seal. He held it up, holding it perfectly still, so Trent could see the unmistakable reality of the legal paperwork. Your grandmother lived a very modest life by choice. Not by necessity, Mr. Sterling said, his words dropping into the quiet room like heavy, devastating stones. She was an incredibly shrewd investor. Over the course of 40 years, she built a highly diversified, massive financial portfolio. Mr. Sterling looked directly into Trent's terrified eyes and read the exact numbers out loud. She transferred the absolute free and clear deed to this property into the trust, he stated firmly. And she transferred the entirety of her investment accounts. The current verified valuation of that portfolio is exactly $2.5 million. Lauren let out a sharp, audible gasp. Her hands began to shake so violently that the pad of bright neon pink sticky notes slipped completely from her fingers. The small bright pink squares fluttered pathetically to the hardwood floor, landing right next to her expensive high heels. $2.5 million. The number hung in the air, a massive, unbelievable fortune that had been hiding right under their arrogant noses for their entire lives. Trent was completely paralyzed. He stared at the legal documents on the table, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. $2.5 million, he finally managed to whisper. He looked at Lauren, his eyes wide with a sudden manic gleam of pure, unadulterated greed. We are rich. He practically choked on the words. Lauren, she left us millions. We do not even need to sell this house. We are actual millionaires. He turned back to Mr. Sterling, a frantic, desperate smile stretching across his pale face. He took a step toward the dining table, reaching out his hand as if he expected the attorney to simply hand him a massive check right then and there. I am the eldest grandson, Trent said rapidly, his voice thick with a sickening level of entitlement. I am her only male heir. I am the head of this family. If she put everything into a trust, then I am obviously the primary beneficiary. You need to transfer those funds to my account immediately. I have massive investment opportunities waiting for capital. Mr. Sterling did not hand him the paperwork. He simply looked at Trent with an expression of profound, absolute pity mixed with deep disgust. He slowly turned his head and looked across the living room, locking his sharp eyes directly onto me. I sat quietly in my floral armchair. I had not moved. I had not spoken. I simply watched my brother completely humiliate himself, blinded by his own toxic, endless greed. Mr. Sterling looked back at Trent. He slowly lifted the heavy, cream-colored document and read the final devastating declaration aloud. I hereby name my granddaughter Chloe as the sole exclusive and absolute beneficiary of this irrevocable trust. Mr. Sterling read his voice ringing with finality. She alone holds the legal right to all properties, all investment portfolios, and all physical assets within this estate. No other family member, specifically including my grandson Trent, is entitled to a single cent. The silence that followed was so profound, it felt like the air had been entirely sucked out of the room. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner suddenly sounded incredibly loud, marking the exact moment my brother's entire universe completely shattered. Trent's smug, frantic smile completely evaporated. It melted off his face, replaced by a look of sheer, absolute terror. He stared at Mr. Sterling, shaking his head violently back and forth, completely refusing to accept the reality of the words he had just heard. "No," Trent screamed, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. "No, that is impossible. That is an absolute lie. She would never do that to me. I am the golden child. I am the one who is going to be successful. Chloe is just a pathetic, boring little payroll clerk. She does not know how to manage millions of dollars. She cannot even afford to fix her own car." He lunged toward the dining table, slamming his fists down onto the polished mahogany right next to the briefcase. "This is a forgery!" Trent yelled, spittle flying from his lips as he desperately pointed at the official gold seal on the documents. "You are a fake lawyer. She paid you to print up fake papers because she is jealous of my success. I have the original will. I am the executor. I have the power of attorney. I am legally in charge of her finances. You cannot just come in here and steal my inheritance." Lauren stepped forward, completely abandoning her Prada bag on the floor. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "You scheming, disgusting little thief!" she shrieked, her voice echoing painfully off the walls. "You manipulated a dying old woman. You forced her to sign those papers because you knew Trent was going to be rich and you were going to be nothing. We are going to sue you. We are going to take you to court and completely destroy you." I finally stood up from the floral armchair. I set my coffee mug down on the small table. I looked at my brother and his wife. They were completely unhinged, screaming about their stolen inheritance, absolutely convinced that they were the victims of a massive conspiracy. They thought this was the end of the reveal. They thought losing the $2.5 million was the absolute worst thing that was going to happen to them today. They had absolutely no idea that the trap had not even fully closed yet. I stood in the exact center of the living room, watching my older brother and his greedy wife entirely unravel. They were loudly screaming about ridiculous forgeries and completely empty lawsuits, but their angry voices were starting to sound incredibly hollow and desperately weak in the quiet space of my grandmother's house. Mr. Sterling did not react to their chaotic volume or their wild accusations. He did not ask them to lower their voices. He did not tell them to calm down. He simply stood completely still next to the polished mahogany dining table, acting as an immovable force of absolute legal authority. His sharp silver hair caught the soft gray light filtering gently through the front bay window. He looked exactly like an incredibly patient expert hunter, watching a terrified animal completely exhaust itself inside an inescapable steel trap. When Trent finally stopped his hysterical screaming, just to take a ragged, desperate breath, Mr. Sterling slowly and deliberately reached his hand back down into the open, dark leather briefcase. The thick stack of original trust documents was already sitting on the dining table, but he was reaching for something else entirely. The living room suddenly grew completely silent again. The only sound was the incredibly heavy, rapid breathing coming from my panicked brother. Mr. Sterling pulled a single manila folder from the depths of the heavy briefcase. He did not rush his movements. He opened the plain folder and took out a single piece of heavy, white paper. I could clearly see a bright red stamp boldly pressed into the top right corner of the crisp document. It was the official insignia of the Pacific Northwest Bank Fraud Investigation Department. Mr. Sterling held the paper with both of his hands and looked directly at Trent. The absolute coldness in the attorney's sharp eyes made the temperature in the room instantly plummet. He told Trent that the irrevocable trust was only the very first part of the devastating reality he needed to accept today. He said there was a much more pressing and immediate legal matter that required his full and undivided attention. Trent stared at the piece of paper, his eyes darting back and forth in complete and utter panic. He swallowed hard. His arrogant chest completely stopped puffing out. The false confidence that had defined his entire existence was visibly draining out of his body, leaving him looking hollow and terrified. Mr. Sterling read the document perfectly clearly. He stated that our grandmother passed away at exactly 4:12 in the morning on Tuesday. He looked up from the paper and stared right through my brother. He said the nursing staff at the hospice facility officially recorded the precise time of death and permanently signed the medical certificate at exactly 4:12 in the morning. He asked to Trent if he understood the profound legal significance of that exact specific time. Trent did not answer. He just stood there sweating profusely in his expensive dark suit. He looked like a man standing on the train tracks, watching a massive freight train speeding directly toward him with absolutely no way to step off the rails. Mr. Sterling did not wait for a response. He continued his explanation with absolute brutal precision. He explained that a power of attorney is strictly a living document. It simply grants legal authority to act on behalf of a living, breathing person. But the absolute specific millisecond that a person dies, the power of attorney completely and permanently expires. It becomes completely useless and entirely void under the law. Your power of attorney expired at exactly 4:12 in the morning on Tuesday. Trent. Mr. Sterling said, his voice ringing like a heavy iron bell in the quiet living room. You had absolutely no legal authority to access her financial accounts after that exact minute. But certified bank records clearly show that you intentionally logged into the secure digital banking portal at 6:30 that same morning. You initiated a wire transfer of exactly $120,000 from her checking account directly into your personal holding account in Colorado. Trent opened his mouth to speak, but his voice completely failed him. He raised a shaking hand to his chest, as if his heart was physically giving out. The reality of the timeline was crashing down on him. Mr. Sterling took a step closer to my brother. He told Trent that because he transferred those stolen funds across state lines using a federal digital banking network, after his legal authority had permanently expired, he did not just take an unauthorized personal loan. He committed federal interstate wire fraud. He committed grand theft. Mr. Sterling said the bank fraud department had officially audited the timeline of the digital transaction. They had already completely locked and frozen Trent's personal accounts. Every single dollar Trent possessed was currently seized by federal banking authorities, pending a massive, aggressive criminal investigation. Mr. Sterling then delivered the final, completely devastating blow. He told Trent that he owed the estate exactly $120,000 immediately. If the stolen funds were not replaced in full right away, the bank would officially press federal charges and hand the entire case over to the authorities for criminal prosecution. The words completely crushed whatever tiny, pathetic fragment of reality Trent was still blindly clinging to. His legs physically gave out underneath him. He stumbled backward helplessly and collapsed heavily onto one of the antique wooden dining chairs. The chair groaned under his sudden dead weight. Trent gripped the edges of the wooden seat, his knuckles turning completely white from the strain. He bent forward, staring blindly at the hardwood floor, and began to aggressively hyperventilate. He was taking huge, desperate, gasping breaths, but he looked like he was completely suffocating in the middle of the room. The golden boy, the visionary entrepreneur, the man who had cruelly mocked me for being a simple, practical payroll clerk, was completely and utterly destroyed. He was entirely trapped by his own massive greed. Lauren was standing a few feet away from him. The designer Prada ski bag was still draped casually over her arm. She had been absolutely silent while Mr. Sterling detailed the severe criminal charges of the wire fraud. But as the absolute reality of the grim situation finally settled into her shallow, calculating brain, her expression completely transformed. She looked at Trent collapsing pathetically in the chair. She realized that he did not just lose the massive $2.5 million inheritance. She realized that his personal bank accounts were totally frozen by the federal government. She realized the money they had just recklessly spent in Aspen on vintage champagne and designer coats was stolen, and they had absolutely no way to ever pay it back. She realized she was married to a man who had zero money, zero inheritance, and was actively facing years in a federal prison cell. Her face twisted into an incredibly ugly mask of absolute hatred. She turned on him instantly. She did not offer him a single ounce of comfort or wifely support. She screamed his name at the top of her lungs. She shrieked that he had completely lied to her about his wealth. She yelled that he had promised her they were incredibly rich, and that he had completely ruined her life with his stupid, illegal mistakes. She was hyperventilating too, but entirely out of pure selfish rage. She screamed that she was absolutely not going to go down for his pathetic crimes. She turned around and stomped her expensive high heels toward the front door. She did not even look back at her husband as she grabbed the brass door handle and practically ripped the heavy wooden door open. She vanished out into the rain, leaving him entirely alone. I stood up from my spot in the living room. I walked slowly across the original oak hardwood floor until I was standing right in front of the antique dining chair where my brother was completely melting down. I looked down at him. For 32 years, I had made myself incredibly small so he could feel huge. I had given up my savings, my peace of mind, and my self-respect to protect him from his own terrible choices. I had worked double shifts and lived in a tiny apartment while he played the wealthy businessman. I was entirely done. I looked down at his shaking shoulders and his expensive tailored suit. My voice was perfectly calm and incredibly cold as I spoke. "You told me to figure out the funeral because I am good at budgeting, Trent," I said softly, making sure he heard every single syllable of my voice over his heavy, gasping breaths. "Now it is your turn to figure out how to avoid federal prison. Get out of my house." Trent slowly raised his heavy head. His face was covered in cold sweat and pathetic tears. He looked absolutely broken. He did not say a single word in his own defense. He slowly stood up from the antique chair, his legs shaking violently beneath him. He grabbed his wet designer suit jacket from the wooden banister and stumbled clumsily out the front door, walking blindly out into the freezing Portland rain. Mr. Sterling quietly stepped forward and closed the heavy wooden door behind him, firmly securing the new deadbolt locks. The house was finally and completely silent. The heavy, crushing burden I had carried for my entire life was permanently gone. 6 months later, the Portland weather had finally turned incredibly warm and sunny. I was sitting on my grandmother's front porch, gently rocking in her old wooden chair and drinking a warm cup of herbal tea. The neighborhood was quiet and deeply peaceful. A lot had fundamentally changed in 6 short months. Trent's entire house of cards had spectacularly and completely collapsed. Without the stolen funds, he could not keep up the grand illusion of his wealth. He was forced to declare complete personal bankruptcy. He ended up taking a miserable restrictive plea deal to avoid spending decades in a federal prison cell, but his life was entirely ruined. Lauren did not stick around to support him through his endless legal battles. She formally filed for divorce the very next week, taking whatever small physical assets he had left to his name. He was currently living in a tiny rented room, working a grueling minimum wage job, trying desperately to pay back the enormous financial restitution he legally owed the estate. I did not feel sorry for him at all. I felt completely free. I had officially taken full control of the $2.5 million trust. I immediately quit my exhausting, underpaid job as a payroll clerk. I used a very small portion of the investments to start my very own independent bookkeeping firm, working right out of my grandmother's beautiful mahogany study. I replaced the broken wooden drawer and kept the thick dark green ledger sitting right on the center of the desk as a daily reminder of her brilliant calculating strength. I also set up a generous local music scholarship, entirely in my grandmother's name, helping underprivileged neighborhood kids afford private lessons and new instruments. It felt like the absolute perfect way to truly honor the beautiful legacy she had quietly built while fiercely protecting me from the shadows. I learned the most valuable lesson of my entire life during those dark, stressful days after she passed away. Family is not just about sharing blood or a last name. Family is about who actually shows up when the monitor flatlines. It is about who holds your hand in the dark, and who protects your future when you are not even looking. Setting firm, unyielding boundaries with toxic people is not a cruel act. It is exactly how you protect your own peace and secure your own beautiful future. If you have ever had to stand up to a toxic sibling, or if you truly believe that karma always comes around to fully collect its massive debts, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments below exactly where you are watching from and what time it is right there. I genuinely read every single one of your comments, and I absolutely love connecting with you all. Take care of yourself out there, and I will see you in the very next story.